An expensive foreign car stopped at the gate of the city cemetery. The guard, recognizing the owner of the car, ran out to greet the important visitor. "Charlie, are there any workers here? I'm gonna need some help. I want to clean up Emily's grave." A young man in an expensive suit came out of the car, leaning on a stick. "Not before you," Alex Peterson Charlie replied. "It's been almost a year. Have you lost weight? Are you sick?" "Boredom. Both, Charlie." Both Alex answered thoughtfully and headed toward the tombstones. He had no strength to walk to his wife's grave, but overcoming his weakness, he walked carefully, stepping and leaning on his stick. "I don't worry about the workman," the watchman shouted after him. "I'll send him to you as soon as he's done with his business. His name is Timmy." Alex nodded his head and moved on. Carefully stepping over the unevenness of the path, he was feeling particularly unwell today. But Alex put it down to the excitement of the sorrowful memories. Charlie stood for a moment, looking back at the Alex he remembered forever. He'd never remembered such a lavish funeral in his life, and he'd worked as a cemetery caretaker for 30 years. That day, a young woman, Alex Chandler's wife, was being buried. The crowd was enormous, and there was an ocean of flowers. The mahogany coffin was carried on his hands, and behind him the husband walked, grief-stricken. As they began to fill in the grave, Alex suddenly climbed down and lay down beside it, asking the men to bury him with his wife. Several men dragged the dying Alex out of the hole as he sobbed and screamed the name of his beloved. He had to be held down until the ambulance paramedics arrived and heavily sedated him. And then he only cried and complained bitterly to his Emily. "Who did you leave me for?" The men around him, seeing such heartbreaking grief, could not hide their tears. And Alex's subordinates were shocked by the behavior of their boss, who at work was considered a tough and demanding, but at the same time a fair manager. Therefore it was they, his colleagues and friends, who later ordered a sculpture for his grave from a famous sculptor. It was a figure of an angel made of white marble. A beautiful girl, very similar to Emily, sat on the pedestal and looked into the distance. This gift pleased the grieving Alex, and after the funeral, he often went to the grave and told his wife how his day was. It went on like that for 2 months. Then Charlie noticed that Alex had stopped visiting the deceased. It surprised the watchman, but then he accepted it. And then today, Alex showed up again. "Hello, my love," he said quietly and stroked the angel's hand. "I'm sorry I didn't show up for a long time. I had a lot of work to do. But I think about you every day. See, I brought your favorite orchids. All your flowers in the house are fine. Don't worry. The maid takes care of them. I had to hire an au pair. You know how it is. I can't do it without you. She's also a good cook. Not as good as you, of course, but it's good, so I eat well. Oh, if I knew how you were, and if there was anything there, I'd feel better." Alex Peterson looked around. The monument was covered in dust. The sculptures, installed almost a year ago, had wilted, and the grave mound itself was overgrown with grass. The fence needed painting.
And he needed a bench to sit on. Standing was a little hard for him.
"Good evening," came a cheerful voice from behind him. In front of Alex Peterson stood a young man about his age, wearing worn work clothes. He was just as tall, but more muscular, and ruddy cheeks from working outdoors. In short, a big guy. Unlike Alex, who, looking at the man, was a little jealous of his energy. "Yes, there is a lot of work here," Alex Peterson answered and looked at the gravedigger. "Don't look at me like that. I don't drink. Only on holidays, and then a little." The worker guessed what the client was thinking and quickly switched to informal communication. "My name is Timothy. You can just call me Timmy. I'm not judging." Alex Peterson somehow blushed, finally giving himself away. "The main thing for me is that the work was done well." "My name is Alex," the man said, and they shook hands. Timmy was surprised. What a weak handshake for a rich man, but he didn't show it. He must be sick. "Charlie said your wife was buried here," Timmy began, writing down in his notebook all the wishes for the work to be done. "What happened to her?" "She died young." "How old was she?" "Emily was 30, Alex answered and wiped the angel's face with a handkerchief. "She died in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. His truck swerved into oncoming traffic and hit her head on. She didn't stand a chance. When the police called me and invited me to the identification, I was in negotiations with business partners, which I had been chasing for a year. What happened after that? I don't remember very well. It's all a blur. I saw my wife in the coffin, a little blue stocking on her temple, and Emily was gone. And no other injuries on the body. This angel was made to look like her. Too bad, she was beautiful," Timmy said quietly, gazing at the sculpture. "I probably would have died of grief. How did you live through all this? I don't really live, Alex said quietly. He looked back and looked at his new acquaintance with interest, as if he had met his soulmate. Something inside whispered that Timmy was a man who wouldn't let him down. Those words touched Timmy to the very core of his heart. So much sorrow in Alex's eyes. I won't charge you for the work, he said. I'll help you for nothing. And then, catching his eyes, he added, I know you're rich, but I won't take any money. I can't. Do you understand? Alex nodded and turned away. He didn't want a stranger to see his tears. When Timmy realized what was going on, he pretended not to notice and started pulling weeds. But I'm going, Alex said. Here's my phone number. Call. Exchanging contacts. The men said goodbye. Returning back, Alex suddenly felt a surge of strength. It hadn't happened for a long time. For 10 months. So he decided to drop by the office. Colleagues, seeing the boss, smiled at him and waved their hands in greeting. It was obvious that he was a rare guest here. Alex managed the company remotely. He was assisted by his permanent assistant, Willie Stevenson. What, Alex? You look better today, not so pale. The first thing he asked Alex, having entered his office. Colleagues were happy to see you, said to go and ask how you were doing. Yeah, and stuff. Thank you, Willie Stevenson, Alex replied. It's nice that you and the others care about me so much. Today I finally went to Emily's grave, hired a worker there. He's going to do everything. And I felt better, like Emily had given me strength. So I thought I'd stop by and do some work, help you out. It's hard enough without me around here. I see sales are down. That worries me. Don't worry, we'll get through this, Willie Stevenson said. It's not that bad. There's money. People want to work. There's no staff turnover. And that's the most important thing. Well, why do you feel better? That's good. That employee you're talking about, can you trust him? He didn't take any money, and you're sure of him. You know what? Why don't I send my guys over? And they'll set up a hidden camera, and you can check in on him at any time to see how he's doing. It's embarrassing. He seems like a nice guy. I don't want to be insulted by mistrust. I like Timmy, a simple and hard-working man, and most importantly, there aren't many of them these days, Alex replied, embarrassed. Trust but verify, Willie Stevenson said, raising his index finger. And Alex agreed to the proposal. His mood was elevated because the weakness and dizziness had receded, and he accepted the invitation of the staff to have lunch with them. To Alex's surprise, his appetite allowed him to eat half of a veal meat dish, something he couldn't afford before because of his health problems. Poor Alex was simply not retaining food. The doctors had fought to solve the problem, but other than baby food, he couldn't eat anything. Now some meat. This was a real victory for him. Willie Stevenson was genuinely pleased. He wanted to think that all of Alex's bad things would be behind him, but he was wrong. In the evening, when Alex returned home, an hour later he had a headache, fever again, and his strength began to leave him, as if some unknown hand clutched his heart and did not let him breathe. He was ready to give everything for that evening with colleagues, where he was nice and cozy. There was laughter and jokes all around, and people's kind looks were fixed on him. Maybe this house is to blame, Alex thought to himself. What if it became my enemy after Emily left? No, she and I were happy here. We wanted to have children, but we didn't have time. We thought it wasn't time yet. Alex Peterson, will you be having dinner, too? Jessica asked thoughtfully when she came into the living room. I have a meat dish with vegetables. No, I don't want to. I had dinner with my coworkers, celebrating a victory. And now this dinner has something against me, Alex tried to joke, but he cringed at the pain in his stomach. But your doctors have forbidden you to leave home for a long time. His assistant reassured him. It's dangerous for your health. Don't go out for long periods of time. It affects your health. I don't know, Alex replied. I was out of town today at the cemetery. I decided to check on Emily. I was very tired for such a long time, but after an hour it felt much better. Maybe it's her giving me strength? Yeah, that's crazy, Jessica argued, and I could hear the consternation in her voice. The doctors strongly advised you to avoid long-distance travel, much less driving yourself.
What if you get sick on the way? What then? Well, then I'll be next to my wife and say hi to her, Alex replied and grinned. To be honest, I'm already tired of all this. No medication helps, can't leave the house. They won't put me in the hospital, since all my vitals are normal. Then what's wrong? Why am I so bad? It's been almost a year now.
Jessica remained silent. She quietly closed the door and went to water the flowers. The only legacy left from Alex's wife. The entire house was buried in greenery. On the second floor of the mansion in the very center, under a glass dome-shaped roof instead of a living room, was a flower greenhouse. What kind of flowers were there in it? Vines descended from the high ceiling. Seedlings were arranged in tiers like pyramid gardens. Family friends, knowing about Emily's passion, considered it their duty to bring back a cuttings of some flower from foreign trips. "You guess what I brought you back from India?" Willie Stevenson once said, holding a small fragile leaf behind his back. "Is it a parrot's beak?" marveled Emily. She was happy with such gifts, which she took in her hands like a fragile treasure and raised like her own children. Some of the flowers even had names. The pride of the mistress of the house was several dozen varieties of orchids. Here in the greenhouse every day Alex liked to visit, remembering the happy days spent with his beloved. That's why Jessica had a huge responsibility not to endanger any of the owner's flowers. When Alex was looking for a home assistant, the main criterion was the ability to take care of plants, including tropical ones, and cooking and everything else in second place. Jessica was that person. She cooked mediocrely, but she knew all kinds of roses and other exotic plants, the names of which can break the language. After a week of work, Jessica proved to be a knowledgeable and responsible person who could be trusted. With her arrival, the house seemed to glow with new colors. In addition, Alex was impressed with her ability to turn his wife's unattended garden back into a blooming paradise. "And let's put comfortable seats in the center of the greenhouse, so you can enjoy the aroma of flowers and plants, and relax after a hard day's work," Jessica suggested once. "That's a great idea, isn't it?" Alex rejoiced. Since then, the greenhouse became the favorite place of the owner of the house. The caring advice of his hands was transferred here. Photos of Emily, in which she was happy next to her husband. This corner of memories warmed Alex's soul. He never forgot his sweet Emily for a moment. One misfortune overshadowed Alex's joy, the gradual fading of strength and terrible pains in the stomach. "If anything, I'll be in the greenhouse," he said, and headed for his most favorite spot in the house. "Okay, I'll just water the flowers," the maid said, and brought a beautiful flower into the conservatory with bright red balls with ornate, fuzzy blue threads sticking out of them. "What is it called?" "I haven't seen it before," Alex asked. "It's an earth paradise," Jessica replied succinctly. "It likes to breathe by the open window in the fresh breeze. So periodically I take him out for a walk and put him on the windowsill. And you don't remember it because it has grown and become so beautiful. Your wife planted it when it was very small. Now I've put it back where it belongs with its fellows. Thank you, Jessica, for caring so reverently for these plants. It means a great deal to me," he thanked her. "It's no trouble to me," the maid replied. "Thank you so much for taking me on such a good job." The next day, Alex received a call from Willie Stevenson. "Alex, surveillance on your wife's grave has been set up. I'll send you the password now, and you can watch the landscaping work being done. You know, what I really wanted was to keep you from being bored at home. Here at least you can see everything with your own eyes and not worry about anything going wrong." "Yeah, that makes sense," Alex agreed. "My health is failing me today, so I'm staying home, but I'll be able to spy on someone I trust, all thanks to you." Never in his life had he ever had to spy on someone on camera. Gaining access for surveillance, Alex tapped into the broadcast. What he saw pleased him. Timmy was working with such enthusiasm, as if this job was some kind of exam for him. He cleanly pulled all the weeds, dug the beds, planted the flowers that had been delivered to him on Alex's orders, and the beds were painted white. The marble angel Timmy wiped down as carefully as if his life depended on it. "Shame on me for not trusting Timmy," Alex thought to himself. "I should give him a gift after all, since he won't take money." At that time, Timmy began to dust off the portrait on the pedestal of the monument. Alex was about to turn off the camera to put the finishing touches on his work, but then a strange incident caught his attention. As soon as the frame of the portrait moved slightly, a small bag fell out from under it. Timmy noticed it too and picked up the unusual find. It was a note wrapped in a plastic envelope, apparently to keep rainwater or snow from getting on the paper. Timmy unfolded the note, began to read, then quickly looked around, picked up his tools, closed the wicket behind him, and left. "Hey, where are you going?" exclaimed Alex Peterson into the cell phone camera, as if Timmy could hear him. "What does it say? How is that even possible? Who texted my wife? Oh my God," putting her on the phone, but it kept ringing off the hook. And Alex couldn't get Timmy on the phone for a long time. His excitement was making it hard for him to breathe. His heart was pounding desperately and was ready to jump out of his chest. Alex had never regretted being sick so much. Otherwise, he would have run to find Timmy, who hadn't even bothered to call. Anger at the absent-minded assistant was eating him up from the inside. It was probably what gave him the strength to get downstairs, get in the car, and drive to the office. "Hello, Alex Peterson," greeted his secretary, and was surprised by the silence of the chief, who always said hello. Found out how her grandson was doing in school. and now with a stone face passed by, as if a stranger. In fact, Alex was in a hurry, if his slow, limping gait could be called that. He was heading for someone who could solve the mystery of the note. "Hello, Tony," Alex said, stepping into the small room at the end of the hallway. "I need your help." Tony looked at the supervisor and nodded his head. Tony was a taciturn man in general, but a lot of people thought he was strange. When he'd come to apply for a job at Alex's company after graduation, the HR people had turned him down, thinking the kid didn't have much experience. It was only the head of the company who recognized the stubby, snub-nosed guy as a technology genius, ordering him to return Tony and give him a job as deputy head of the cybersecurity department. "Tony, can you read what the note says?" Alex asked, holding out a flash drive. He silently took it and worked his magic on it for a couple minutes. After another moment, he printed out a sheet of text. "The handwriting on the note is unsteady and choppy." Tony interrupted his silence. It was either written by a very upset woman or a child. Alex picked up the piece of paper with trembling hands, where the scribbles written in ballpoint pen were clearly too wound. "Hello, you don't know me, but I know you. Where are you?" She promised me. "Take me, okay. My address is 34 Mayflower Street." Knocked twice. What is this? Alex asked himself. "I don't understand anything." "You know what there is to understand," Tony said. "We have to go to the address." "Do you want me to go with you? You look a little pale." "I don't know what's going on." "No need. There's a lot of work to do. You've done me a good favor." "Thank you. I'm glad I brought you into our company then." Tony cracked a smile. "Come on." "Thank you." As the satisfied chief walked past the secretary, as if seeing her for the first time all day, he asked, "Good afternoon, Jessica. How's your grandson? Did he get in another fight at school?" "Good afternoon, Alex Peterson. I'm fine. Thank you." The secretary said hello for the second time. Alex smiled back and left, leaving the assistant puzzled. And by late afternoon, rumors were flying around the office that their beloved boss wasn't himself. Tony was the only one who knew what was wrong. Alex headed to the address given in the note. He couldn't wait to see the man who knew his wife so well. He also wanted to punch Timmy in the nose for hiding the note. When the car stopped near the small house on the corner of the street, Alex Peterson saw that a man was already knocking on the door twice, as the note said. Alex hurried as far as his strength allowed towards the mysterious house. The stranger turned around. It was Timmy. "Oh, you insolent bastard. How dare you not give me the note?" Alex exclaimed and grabbed him by the scruff of his shirt. Timmy easily freed himself from Alex's weak grip and, seeing that he was losing his balance, managed to support him. "You've got it all wrong, haven't you?" shouted the offended Timmy. "I found that note by accident. I didn't want to worry you. You're so sick. I just wanted to find whoever wrote it and bring him to you. Here, take this paper." And Timmy held out a piece of theater paper. Alex took it carefully, as if it were a cherished jewel. Both of them stood in silence and looked at the scribbles. "Why are you guys fighting?" They turned around and saw a frightened boy of about 9 years old with eyes huge with fear. He was unkemptly dressed, obviously neglected, looking like a vagrant. His cheeks were overgrown, his hands were dirty, and his shoes were begging for porridge. Yet the whole appearance of the boy was pleasing. He had a... "No, he won't," answered Bobby briefly. "I once sat on my mom's grave for 3 whole days and he didn't even notice I was gone." "Yes, and now he's in town looking for money for a bottle. Then he'll find vodka to drink. He'll be with his drinking buddies. They fight and fight so much that I'm afraid to sleep. I hide in the storeroom, and there are mice running around." This story made Alex Chandler's hair stand on end, and his ailment seemed nothing compared to what this little boy was experiencing every day. And then Alex felt that for a whole hour he felt neither pain nor weakness, and that made him happy. "It looks like Emily is sending me a sign from above. This kid is going to bring me happiness." "Are you two brothers?" "So you're going to be my uncle?" Bobby asked when he had finished all the desserts. He looked at Alex and Timmy carefully. "Do you two always go out together?" "No, we're not related," Timmy said. "Just happen to be." "By the way," Timmy, Alex said, "I have a handyman position opening up at the farm. Why don't you come work for me? I'll give you a place to live. Will the guest house suit you?" "Sure it will," Timmy exclaimed. "You won't regret hiring me, will you? I can do everything. I can build, I can plumb, and I can take care of the garden. And what kind of kebabs can I cook? You'll love it." "Then it's a deal," Alex smiled. "But you, Bobby, are coming to live with me." Still asking Alex, Bobby rejoiced. "Can I call you that for now?" Alex nodded and found he wasn't even dizzy. His mood was at an all-time high. He certainly wouldn't be bored now. "Now that's dominant," Bobby exclaimed in admiration, cocking his head upward. "You could fit a whole school in here." and there's an arrow spinning on the roof. Look, Timmy. While the new tenants were getting acquainted with the house, Alex went to look for Jessica. There was no one in the greenhouse, and only the carriage stood lonely by the open window. Having gone around all the rooms, Alex found his assistant in the garden. She was lying in a hammock reading a book. Jessica, from this day on we will have new tenants. My son Bobby and the handyman Timmy now. You won't be bored either, but it'll be more fun at home too. What son? Jessica wondered. The future one, Alex smiled. I'm going to go make dinner, Jessica answered and smiled strangely. Alex noticed it, but thought he was imagining it. What luck to feed such a bunch of people and clean up after them, Jessica thought with annoyance. That wasn't the deal. You said the smell of that flour you brought back from Colombia would poison him quickly. Jessica was angry, speaking over the phone. The man in question was still alive, though he could barely move. For 10 whole months, she had labored like a horse here. Whoever was on the other end of the line asked her to calm down. Jessica pulled herself together, smiled, and turned to go into the house. That's when she ran nose to nose with Bobby, who was looking at a bird in a tree. Maybe he'd heard everything. Are you playing spies? The boy asked with interest. What kind of spies? Jessica wondered. Well, you just said on the phone that you had to kill someone. I figured as much, Bobby replied simply. That's my business. What am I playing at? Jessica shouted. Weren't you eavesdropping? Curious Varvara turned around and walked away, leaving Bobby with his mouth open in surprise. The boy sincerely did not understand why he had offended this ant. Half an hour later, Timmy got under Jessica's hot hand and decided to tighten the faucet in the kitchen. My name is Timmy, he introduced himself as he entered. I fixed the faucet. Why didn't you call the plumber? There's plenty of work for him to do around here. It's lucky I'll be here now. So everything will be fine. There's a purple savior, Jessica snickered. Where'd you come up with that? Redheads. Why are you picking on Alex? Spongers? You watch your mouth. He took Timmy's hand in Arizona. We probably don't work for a day's labor either, so you can't talk like a human being. How come Alex keeps you here, or don't talk to him? And Timmy left the kitchen. And then he refused to go to lunch, not wanting to eat food prepared by such unkind hands. The next day, Alexa decided to visit her family lawyer, as the case was too sensitive for a phone conversation. In the morning, though, he woke up again broken, and with a feeling of heaviness in his chest, forced himself to swallow a piece of toast and got into his car. At the law firm's office, his lawyer, trustee Nicholas Graham, was already waiting for him. Is something wrong? The elderly lawyer asked, helping Alex to a chair. Yes, the man said, barely breathing. Tell me, has my wife approached me about adopting Bobby? She did, Nicholas Graham answered, but she wanted to keep it a secret. That's why I didn't tell you, Alex, you see. As it turned out, Emily couldn't have children because of a fatal hereditary disease that was passed down the female line. Her grandmother and mother got over it, but Emily didn't. She didn't want to tell you so she wouldn't worry. And then she met this kid, a redhead like you found him. I couldn't find him, even though I looked for him. Yeah, he found himself, Alex said. But how come? Emily didn't say she was sick, and she didn't even look sick. I didn't want to bother you, the lawyer replied sadly. I mean, you've been so busy. The news would have knocked you out, but then I would have spent more time with her and wouldn't have argued over nothing. Alex grabbed his head. And even though Emily ... what's done is done, Nicholas Graham sighed. But now you'll have a son to pass your business on to. I've seen that boy. He's a good, funny kid, Alex answered quietly. His head was dizzy from such news. So this car accident had spared Emily the agony she was about to suffer. You could say that the lawyer shook his head. The disease was incurable. There was little chance of recovery. She realized it, but she held firm. The doctors gave her only 6 months. That's the way it was. Alex cried. The tears wouldn't stop. Nicholas Graham put his arm around his shoulders. They sat like that for a long time. Each of them remembered his own grief. When Alex returned home, he got an unpleasant surprise. There was swearing in the kitchen, during which Bobby's shrieking and Jessica's voice stood out the most. Alex was surprised that a nice, quiet house helper could be so shouting and rude. Get out of here, Jessica shouted. Don't be a housekeeper. You broke an egg, and now I have to mop the floor. But you pushed me, didn't you? Timmy justified himself. You knocked the groceries out of my hands. I was going to fry myself some eggs. I'm in charge. You can't have 2 masters in the kitchen, Jessica yelled. You don't want to go through other people's fridges. But Bobby asked you to give him something to eat. And you ignored him, Timmy said. so I thought I'd feed him, and I need to eat before I work in the garden. Breakfast was at 8:00. That Bobby should have gotten less sleep, Jessica whispered. The kid's on vacation. He's getting enough sleep. Timmy stood up for the boy. Why are you so angry anyway? It's none of your business who you are. When Alex entered the kitchen, all arguments stopped instantly. Timmy went outside and Jessica obligingly said, Alex Peterson, are you hungry? Shall I cook something or serve a ready-made diet meal? No, thank you. Better feed the boys and I'll go get some rest. I've had too much going on today. And can you please explain to me why you're fighting with Timmy? He steals food. He doesn't pay for anything, Jessica started, but Alex interrupted her complaint. He has a right to come in here and take whatever he wants. And so does Bobby. I told you yesterday, these are my new tenants. And Bobby's about to officially become my son. The lawyer's getting the paperwork drawn up. Good, Jessica replied sullenly, frantically thinking about what to pack, and that Timmy of yours has been hitting on me. How? Alex was surprised. When did he do it? This morning, Jessica said resentfully. He's so insolent. You have no idea. All right, I'll talk to him, Alex promised. When he told her what the maid had told him, Timmy was speechless with indignation. He resented his master for believing Jessica. Bobby, for his part, stood up for his friend, telling him how Jessica had chased him out of the kitchen, called him bad names, and then attacked Timmy. Alex was caught between two fires and decided to watch for now. But Jessica still found a way to pull the blanket over him. One day, when only Timmy and Jessica were in the kitchen, she suddenly screamed like a wounded elephant and started tearing her clothes. Timmy thought she had spilled hot sauce on herself. He started to help her take off her apron, but she suddenly dug her nails into his face. The pain made him scream. A panting Alex Peterson came down screaming. The rush had taken a lot out of him, so he was breathing hard. What happened? Alex asked, looking around the kitchen. He attacked me, Jessica exclaimed, crying crocodile tears. He started tearing my clothes. I had to defend myself. If it hadn't been for you, he would have abused me. What are you talking about? Timmy screamed. I didn't touch her. I thought you were a guy for ripping your sweatshirt. Alex just shook his head. He'd known Jessica longer than Timmy had. That's why he believed her. You're going to have to leave, he said quietly to Timmy. Alex left the kitchen, and 5 minutes later Timmy was gone. Timmy was hurt that Jessica had been able to make him look like a monster, even though she was the wolf in sheep's clothing. Where are you going to go? Bobby asked. I won't be lost, don't worry. See how it turned out, said Timmy. And you, buddy, be careful and keep an eye on that Jessica. I don't like her. My heart tells me she's up to no good. Okay, Bobby nodded and hugged him. Bobby took Timmy's words to heart. He followed Jessica like a shadow everywhere he went. One day, when Alex wasn't home, she put the plant in front of the open window again. While Jessica watered it, she talked quietly to it. Grow, big poisonous one. Well done, flower. You're crushing your host little by little. You're also smart. You do damage selectively. You don't touch me. And thank you. Too bad your poisonous pollen doesn't work on that nasty boy. These words were clearly heard by Bobby, who was hiding behind a plant. He was thrown into a fever. He was both afraid and happy to know that Alex's illness was the fault of a plant that was easy to get rid of. When Jessica left the greenhouse, Bobby approached the dangerous plant. So that's what you are, scarlet flower, Bobby said. He sniffed the round red flower. It smelled like dirty socks and something else nasty. Pinching his nose, he threw the pot with the plant out the window. There was the crunch of a broken vase. You puppy, Jessica shouted. Why did you throw away such an expensive gift? Take this, you filthy tramp. Jessica swung at the frightened boy, but her hand didn't have time to touch the child. Alex held her tightly and looked his maid straight in the eyes. I will not allow children to be beaten, he said dryly. But he's being naughty, Jessica started to justify herself. That boy destroyed your wife's flower. I remember all the flowers Emily used to buy. Do you know why? She asked. Yes, she had such an innocent habit, and that stinking cactus you brought into the house. I didn't realize before why you were lying to me. It's poisonous, Bobby shouted. It stinks and it's poisoning you. Uncle Alex, she told me when she was watering it. I heard her. So I threw it off the second floor. That's a good boy, Alex said. Bobby shuddered and felt goosebumps run up and down his body. Pack your things and leave, Alex said stiffly, turning to Jessica. She ran away frightened, but Bobby stayed behind. Uncle Alex. I think she set Uncle Timmy up, Tui said. Definitely need to get him back. He slapped himself on the forehead. But in the meantime, I need to find out something else. And Alex again asked his father's friend Nicholas Graham for help. He listened attentively and not without horror to his godson, and asked only one question. When exactly did Jessica appear in your house? 2 months after Emily's death. Literally the same day I told my partners I wanted to hire an assistant, Alex replied. And what about Emily? It was suspiciously quick, Nicholas Graham reflected. My spouse has been looking for a domestic helper for at least a month, and then Alexa steps in. We need to think about it. Later that evening, Nicholas Graham called his mentee. Can you believe this Jessica of yours turned out to be Buchanan's own sister? Remember him? But the one who was always dissatisfied with everything and made hasty bad decisions. Did you have to kick him off the board of directors? And he swore revenge on you then? He sure was, Alex marveled. So he's the one behind the poisoning. Yes, Jessica brought that weird flower that's banned from Latin American homes. It poisons whoever is affected by its pollen contained on the long stamens, not these flowers. Fascinating. It can. And you can't prove anything. There was no poison in the blood tests, and the flower was already thrown away, Alex exclaimed. How are you feeling now, Alex? Nicholas Graham asked. Great, like I've always been like this. Didn't even notice, said Alex. That's because you don't notice your health, explained the family friend. As the years go by, you only notice its absence. We're in my 30s, and the men laughed heartily, shedding the weight of worry and pain. At lunch, Alex and Bobby ate what they could make themselves, along with bacon pizza and sweet rolls. You stay for the host, Alex said in a businesslike tone. Where are you going? Bobby asked. We gotta track down Timmy. I feel bad for them, sighed Alex. By evening, Bobby had made some dumplings he found in the freezer and was waiting for Alex. He was hungry, and even the unpleasant smell didn't deter his appetite. So he decided to eat alone for a while, reassuring himself that Alex was just late for work. But as the clock ticked past midnight, Bobby got scared. What if he stayed here alone? After sleeping through the night, the boy, convinced that the owner of the house was still gone, decided to go to the person who could help him, and so he went in search of Timmy. Timmy was where he had been before, but only a little tipsy, probably drinking out of resentment, sitting on a brand new bench by Emily's grave. When Timmy saw the boy, he got excited. Oh, who's here? What are you doing here? Did Uncle Alex go looking for you yesterday? He didn't come here first thing. No, Timmy perked up. Did something happen? And then Bobby told what he knew, not leaving out the slightest detail. What a bitch, Timmy exclaimed, sobering up in a flash, and she made me look ugly too. I knew there was something wrong. I gotta go find Alex. Let's go. The first thing they did was head to the police station and report a missing person. The officer on duty smelled the odor of booze. Citizen, he said, go and wake up. Maybe you drunkenly thought your imaginary friend had disappeared, or maybe you just have a white fever, so I can organize you to the sobering up center. Let's go. Timmy realized that this wasn't going to get him anywhere, so he decided to go another way. Where did Jessica live? He asked. They didn't know, but they knew in their gut that she had something to do with Alex's disappearance. What are we going to do now? Bobby was frustrated. I'm the only one who found the file, so he's missing too, he said. You've never called him that before. Timmy was surprised. What's changed? I miss him, Bobby said, his lips quivering. It's okay, we'll find your daddy, Timmy reassured the boy. They didn't go back to Alex's house, but stayed at the old lady's house, where Charlie had kindly let them stay. But they went to watch Alex's house as if they were on a job, hoping that they would catch the thread and unravel the whole tangle of strange happenings. And the next night they were lucky. Jessica was on the doorstep of the house, and she opened the door with her own key without hiding from the neighbors, who thought it was just a maid coming to clean the house. Bobby was tempted to yell something hurtful at her, but Timmy explained that they were spies and were following a criminal. Bobby liked the game. Half an hour later, the former maid left the house holding a small suitcase. Then she got into a car and drove off somewhere. When Timmy and Bobby entered the house, they noticed that the safe was open and there was no money in it. Jessica simply robbed Alex by peeking at the lock code. Obviously, Bobby and Timmy would not have had time to catch up with her, and Jessica would have noticed that she was being followed. So Timmy asked a friend of his to run the license plate number. In a few minutes, the boys knew Jessica's address and calmly drove to her house. They went around the back of the building and heard muffled conversation. Was someone arguing in the basement? Let me go or it's going to get worse. You'll answer to the law for everything. Alex's voice was heard. And you on the jury laughed at first, Jessica said. Didn't I tell you I have another trump card up my sleeve? And this time I'll use it and win your head. What's not to like? I liked cleaning up after you. Alex could hear himself getting sick. But that's it, Timmy said. It's time to call the police. Now we have all the evidence. A SWAT team arrived and rescued Alex, who was already unconscious, and an ambulance crew snatched the resting man from death's grasp. Alex's lawyer quickly found all the loose ends and made sure Jessica, along with her brother, ended up in the dock. They got decent sentences. The case was closed, but none of this pleased Bobby and Timmy, who were on duty at Alex's bedside day and night. What are we going to do? Timmy asked. Would he live? If he gets a blood transfusion, he'll make it, said the attending physician. But we don't have that rare group right now, he said. Would mine work? Timmy asked. I was told in the army that I have a rare blood type. I don't know what military unit I served in. I lost my military ID a long time ago. But then the doctor said, to the treatment room, and he hurried after the nurse. Timmy's blood was a match, and what's more, it was identical. Would you like to do a DNA test for compatibility? The doctor asked. I have a vague suspicion that you and Alexa Chandler are close relatives. Timmy agreed, remembering how Bobby had once referred to him and Alex as brothers, as if they came from an orphanage. There was a great desire to find any of the relatives. While Timmy was working, Alexa's DNA results came back. What do you mean, a sibling? Alex's mouth dropped open in surprise. How could that be possible? Nicholas Graham had to unravel the tangle of unusual events. Timmy came in the evening and went straight to Alex's room. How are you? How are you feeling? You've had a lot of my blood, so don't be surprised if you feel like riding a motorcycle, Timmy laughed. Thanks, brother, Alex said quietly, tears in his eyes. What did you say? Timmy was surprised. Are we really blood brothers? They hugged each other, not believing their happiness. The loneliness was over. Now they had someone to talk to. Your son is your responsibility now, said the daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. If she only knew. Hospital corridor. An old man with greenish tiles looked into my eyes. From the daylight lamp, long children stretched out their thoughts. The ceiling echoed in their temples. Amanda fidgeted nervously with the bracelet on her arm. She walked back and forth along the corridor, adding the clatter of her heels to the sunset of the lamps. She sat down, trying to calm down, then jumped up again. The doors of the operating theater rustled and creaked lightly. A doctor stepped out of them. Amanda jumped up again, looking hopefully at the medic. Doctor, please don't be silent. She folded her arms across her chest in a pleading gesture. The chances are 50-50, the doctor finally said, tightening the mask on her chin, that she'll get out of the pram. Amanda sobbed sorrowfully again. You have to believe in the best. The doctor tried to cheer up the girl. He was still young, he would recover. And I wanted to believe in the best. Of course, Amanda was worried about her husband's health, but she was more concerned about the loss of the family's main income and the question of who would provide for them now. Edgar rode out of the corridor to meet his wife returning from work. Amanda was not in a good mood. Lately, it had become a constant state for her. She had to get up early, work, do household chores, and still care for her disabled husband. How was your day? Edgar asked, taking the bag from the girl. Disgusting, Amanda said sharply, taking off her coat. Edgar left for the kitchen. He was quite brisk with the pram and could even boast some mobility, if it could be called that. The man moved the bag of groceries to the floor near the refrigerator and began to open the door. He could only put his purchases on the first shelf or the bottom of the door. Amanda snatched the bottle of milk she'd opened on the way out, slammed it down, and closed it loosely. It wouldn't leak to the neighbors. Why are you shouting? Edgar looked at her. Would someone wipe it up? You. Amanda felt irritated and developed from her husband's helpfulness. He realized his limited functionality, so he tried not to inconvenience his wife. At first, Edgar was even ashamed, but later he accepted his condition and stopped suffering from remorse. Can you heat it up for yourself? I'm tired. Amanda pulled her hair back with her hands and went into her room. The couch creaked faintly. Bleck the cat rubbed against her leg, begging for a treat. Amanda sat relaxed, exhausted, lethargic, and powerless. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd married the handsome extreme sportsman Edgar. Now he's deprived of his passion and his income. And she has to work for two, running all over town showing cheap flats to poor families. This was not how Amanda planned to spend her youth. Her husband had been in a wheelchair for 6 months. At first they lived on old savings, but those soon ran out. Amanda put off looking for a job until the last minute. She was scared, and her inner state was against it. By the age of 25, the girl had no experience. She worked part-time shooting for online clothing shops, blogging for a young stylist, although she had a good education in the hospitality industry. From the first days, real estate work seemed to Amanda to be useless, incomprehensible payment, running around, a lot of calls, the need to persuade someone to travel to the objects. What kept the girl in such an unloved place? Charming director and owner of the agency, Michael. He appeared there rarely, but every time it happened, in the office began a semblance of scenes from the film office romance. All the few female staff began to intensively put themselves in order to correct makeup, hairstyles, check manicures, and it was done by both very young girl students, working part-time in their spare time, and an elderly accountant, Cassandra. Amanda, too, fell under Michael's spell. And the more time passed, the wider the gap between her and Edgar grew. She stopped believing in the doctor's prognosis, and it was a thankless task to take a chance. But here he was, next to her, a living, handsome man, Michael. Though not hers yet, but it was only a matter of time. Such thoughts daily swarmed the girl's head. There was a constant struggle between duty, feelings, selfishness, and conscience. And that evening, selfishness and inner whims won. At some point, Amanda realized that she didn't care at all about the opinion of others, that she didn't want to support her invalid husband until his retirement and cross out her whole life with it. She too deserves happiness, deserves the joy of being a girl, not to pull a heavy burden on herself. The decision came instantly. It was strange that such a momentous turn was made on an ordinary sofa in an ordinary city flat on an ordinary March evening. "Are you going somewhere?" Edgar asked, watching his wife pack a pile of things into her bag. "Yes," Amanda nodded briefly. "We're going to your mum's." Edgar raised an eyebrow in surprise and grinned with the corner of his mouth. "What kind of nonsense is that? A daughter-in-law wants to go to her mother-in-law's house by herself. The daughter-in-law is tired of working for two." Amanda threw Edgar's trainers into the bag with a swift throw. The man fell silent, and Amanda just burst into tears. "I can't do this anymore, okay? I can't. I'm beautiful, I'm young, I want romance. I want a decent man by my side, I want care and affection, not to look after an invalid." "Amanda." "I'll get out of the wheelchair," Edgar interrupted her. "The doctors said there was a chance. Maybe you won't. I'm sick of this." Amanda threw in her bag a couple more t-shirts and zipped it up with a precise motion. "Are you staying at your mum's? We need to live apart for at least a few months. 6 months. "I don't know." They were both silent. Amanda was dumbfounded. Edgar realized that he was being thrown away like an unnecessary thing. Really, what good is such a helpless and useless husband? "And aren't you afraid to hang close to the ground when you're lying on that mattress?" Mate Terrence shoved Edgar in the shoulder, barely landing. "Fear the wolf," the man grinned, laying the foam on the grass so that he could gather it up without getting tangled in the slings. Edgar and Terrence had been taking tourists on extreme tours to the mountains, the Alaska range, for 5 years. The guys had tried everything that could tickle the nerves and make the flesh shake. Rafting, jumping rope, quad biking, long-distance hiking, mountaineering. But Edgar's greatest passion was paragliding. He spent almost the whole summer in the mountains. He flew, tried, learnt, got bumps, wiped his knees on landing. Once he dislocated his elbow, caught his paraglider on a tree, and fell from a height of a couple of meters to the ground. The air of freedom and the glamour of the mountains beckoned the stubborn lad, who flew where others were afraid to go, and stayed under the clouds for so long that his fingers went numb from the cold. Edgar started riding tourists when he was already convinced of his own skill. So the guy's work, Terrence was the driver and organizer. Edgar was the coordinator and implementer of extreme entertainment. For 6 months they earned so much that the remaining 6 months could not work at all. But they didn't. They simply changed the style of traveling, and instead of paragliding, they went snowboarding and skiing with tourists. Oh dear, finish that stuff you're doing. If you fall from that height, you won't pick up any bones. His mother Cassandra shook her head. But the boy liked to live like that. It was 100 times better than sitting in a stuffy office poking at buttons. Dangerous? So what? It's dangerous to sneeze in a public place these days. So what are we supposed to do? Not go out? Of course not. You've got a great education. Go to the bank, make a career. Mother wouldn't stop. Will the children go to the mountains too? No wife, no kids either. Mum, why are you bothering again? Edgar sighed tiredly. The parent was in her repertoire. Talking about the dangers of paragliding and the frivolity of the tourist business was a regular occurrence, even if it brought in decent money. Edgar met Amanda on a social network. He was bored on a winter evening. The guy scrolled through the news feed and came across the page of a pretty girl. Something about this brunette caught the young man's eye. Word by word, they went on a couple of dates. The girl was impressed by Edgar's boldness and passion. He took her on several trips, even offered to take her paragliding. But Amanda refused the altitude. Everything spun quickly, and in less than 6 months he proposed to her. Edgar was not embarrassed that the chosen one is spoiled, somewhat capricious, ambitious. But she always waited at home, cooked delicious salads and dishes, did not criticize his hobbies. At work, Edgar's wife did not kick out the wife. Let her do what she likes, he said to his mother. I earn enough for 2. At least she's always beautiful and fresh. Amanda was more than happy with this arrangement. She was already dreaming of a full-service travel agency, of a house somewhere by the sea, of her own column in some fashion magazine. Life went on at its own pace. Edgar and his wife lived a year and a half. Her mother gave the young couple her 2-room flat, and she bought a small house in the countryside outside the city on her savings and moved in, but on the condition that soon there would be grandchildren. Edgar guffawed. Amanda rolled her eyes. Children were not in her plans for the next 100 years. But it wasn't necessary to upset Cassandra to know that. Instead of children, Amanda suggested that her husband get a Spitz. Edgar didn't mind and promised that after the next tour they would go together to a breeder and choose a puppy. A happy Amanda stayed home in anticipation, and Edgar and Terrence took the tourists to the mountains. Edgar had been warned by everyone that his fascination with flying would not end well, but fate had other plans. The return trip in the mountains fell on rainy weather. In late August, Terrence drove the minibus with the group, carefully slowing down on the serpentine corners. Edgar was dozing in the front passenger seat, tired from the busy program and the early rise. It all happened in a split second when a dashing local jigger in his car sped out of the corner and into the oncoming traffic. Terrence swerved to the side to avoid the collision. The minibus tipped on its side and slammed into a pole and a concrete barrier. Edgar was literally squeezed in half between the roof and the dashboard. The other passengers were crushed like peas, but fortunately no one else was seriously hurt. They were just abrasions, bruises, contusions, and a couple of broken fingers. Terrence dislocated his arm and suffered a concussion. Breathless Edgar was pulled out by rescue personnel only 40 minutes later. In the mountains in the rain and traveling fast is not even possible for rescuers. He was taken to the nearest hospital, but there was no one there to perform the complicated operation. The man was rushed to the state capital. There he could be given at least a chance to get back on his feet. The operation was a success. Edgar recovered quickly, but he was paralyzed from the waist down. Without words, it was clear that extreme sports were over for good, extreme sports and his favorite job. The minibus was beyond recovery. The firm was ruined. It was left without transport and its chief instructor. Amanda howled wolf as she realized her beautiful, comfortable life was over. Her attitude towards her husband changed almost immediately. Whereas before she had seen him as a hero, a pillar, a leader, a risk-taker, now he was just a source of trouble. Edgar experienced the crisis of loss of mobility for a long time. He became depressed. 10 times a day he revisited photos from his trips, pulled the remains of his parachute out of his rucksack, stroked it, holding it in his hands, sighing, staring at one point. The atmosphere in the flat was heavy. The doctor prescribed Edgar a set of exercises that should have had an effect over time. But the man, disgusted by his helplessness, could not start doing them for a long time. Amanda avoided talking about the accident and didn't poke her husband's nose in his deficiency at first. But as the irritation and strain grew, she sometimes snapped. "Don't be discouraged, son. Believe in the best, and do not give up therapeutic gymnastics called to raise morale only Mother Cassandra." Insurance, who had recovered, came to visit occasionally. But it was hard for him to talk about what he had lost. As time passed, the former paraglider gradually heeded the doctor's advice and began to exercise occasionally, just as Amanda began to think about divorce. Amanda had a breakdown at work. It was a frosty morning in the village. Clusters of rowan berries, covered in hoarfrost like earrings, adorned a bald bush. A flock of sparrows hopped in it with a cheerful chirp. Frost covered the ground. Amanda opened the gate and rolled the pram down the narrow path to the porch. Cassandra popped out of the door wearing a down shawl. The two women pulled the pram into the hay. "How long are you visiting, Amanda?" the mother-in-law asked, shaking an invisible speck off her son's jacket. "Edgar, for a long time. I'm going back to town. I have..." Cassandra was especially concerned about the state of the flat her son had left behind. "Good girl," Cassandra lamented. "She left her husband on my neck. She lives in the city in someone else's mansion and doesn't give a damn. Edgar, get a divorce, I'm telling you. And everything will get better. Stop it." The man waved his mother away, but he believed in his own words less and less. Apathy and longing were eating Edgar. He was tormented by his own idleness, because he could not do most of the housework. Walks were rare. Pulling the pram down a couple of porch steps to the ground was hard. Once again, as Cassandra tried to do so, an elderly neighbor, Norman, peered over the fence at her. "Hey Cassandra, what are you going to do? Say you've got him in your arms," shouted the old man in righteous indignation simply. "Hello, Norman," said the woman. "Well, what else could it be? You'd better help than scratch your tongue. The gate is open." The neighbor ran nimbly, not at all senilely, to the pram and helped it down the steps and onto the path to the gate. At the same time, he asked both Edgar and his mother about what had happened. "It's a misfortune." "A misfortune," the man scratched the back of his head, pushing his knitted cap to the side. "And it's not clear whether he'll get up or not." "I'll get up," Edgar mumbled, feeling terribly embarrassed that the two older men had to deal with him. "I've got it." Norman threw up a finger. "I'll come back tomorrow and tell you how to adapt it for the pram. Then you, grandson," he said to Edgar, "can you get in and out? Better get back on your feet, though. Okay?" Edgar smiled a little and sighed. Norman's not like my grandfather, God rest his soul. A lazy bum, Cassandra exclaimed. All he knew how to do was stuff holes in socks. The company laughed involuntarily. The neighbor soon left, having inspected the porch beforehand, and Cassandra rolled the pram along the pavement to the shop. Amanda opened her laptop after work, sitting down on the soft couch. She didn't look away from a message from her husband with another question. Camila was interested in something else. Today, Michael, the director of the agency, had finally paid attention to her and invited her to coffee together at lunchtime. It was not for nothing that Camila wore short skirts and spent several hours every morning in front of the mirror. The determination with which Camila moved towards the goal of winning the director was worthy of applause. The girl went with the chief to a coffee shop and made it clear that she would not mind to continue communication in a more informal setting. Michael caught the hint, and at the end of lunch invited the pretty employee to dinner at a restaurant at the end of the week. Camila cheered. His suit is definitely not from a local tailor, Camila mumbled under her breath as she looked at her boss's photos on social networking sites. And a decent watch and cufflinks. Her eyes burned with admiration, but more for herself. A month had passed since Camila had put her husband in her mother-in-law's care, and during this time she realized that her life was, in general, not so bad. The work suddenly stopped stressing her. Cooking and cleaning turned into rare worries. There was enough money for herself, and still had time to shoot for clothing catalogs. Sometimes on the mental horizon slipped thoughts of divorce, but so far Camila canceled them. It was necessary to prepare the ground for a run-up, so as not to sit soft place in a puddle. As a calculatingly cunning woman, Camila understood this, and therefore did not hurry. Though Edgar could have served Edgar at any moment. But she would think of something. Yes, and not much believed Camila that kind attached to her Edgar first will go to such a step. The photos of the boss told Camila what she wanted to know. Michael in his 35 years was the owner of a nice house in the suburbs, 2 cars, and clearly had a passion for business things, foreign tailoring. The girl leaned back contentedly on the back of the sofa, scrolling in her head options for outfits for a future date. Her sick husband and the fact that she was legally married did not slow Camila down a bit. She didn't give a damn. X-Day came. Michael picked her up in his car. Since her work in the agency, Camila tried not to spread much about her personal life. She'd taken off her ring right after she'd sent Edgar to the country, and therefore in the car already flirted with her boss, who was 10 years older than her. The girl achieved her goal. In the morning, she woke up in the house of her lover. Michael brought her coffee and asked if the young lady does not want to go to the skating rink. A couple of days later, Camila flirtatiously agreed. Everything went according to plan. She told Michael what he wanted to hear, and he was slipping into an affair with his co-worker. At work, they decided not to advertise their relationship, although it was difficult to hide something in a female team. Soon the whole office was talking about the fact that the manager had a young mistress. Camila quietly laughed at the gossiping colleagues, but did not hurry to reveal the secret. Her goal was Michael, not to hurt the noses of her workmates. The first day of April was too warm. It was as if the sun had reached the clear sky and was now eager to make all the plants grow and bloom in one day. There were even some sleepy flies in the air, dazed by the sudden joy of plus 19 degrees. Norman scratched his stubbled chin and held his visor up, looking at the sun. "It's blooming, isn't it?" He nodded to Edgar. The man sat in his buggy on the porch path, keeping his neighbor company while he reworked the sides into a strong and smooth slope. On Edgar's lap, Black the cat stomped around. He was writhing in pain, digging his paws into his master's lap. "Now we'll put some paste on it, and you'll ride like a racer," the elderly neighbor said contentedly, wielding a hammer. "At least we can do it without breaking traffic laws," Edgar smiled. He'd been a little perked up lately. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was the fact that Amanda had practically abandoned him. Either way, clarity had come. Besides, Edgar had figured out a way to brighten up his hated idleness. He decided to write a book about his journey to paraplegia. He found a blank notebook in his desk and began jotting down ideas. Edgar had never written any texts before, except for essays at school. However, his work was quite vigorous. It was the abundant reading in the winter evenings, as his mother had always favored books and had plenty of them at home. On those same winter evenings, he and his parents, sometimes with neighbors or alone in the kitchen, would read across from each other while drinking herbal tea. At such times, Edgar would forget that he was deprived of the ability to walk and become a little happier. Bleck stretched his striped back, jumped to the ground, and disappeared behind the fence on some feline business of his own. "It's done." Norman surveyed the job well done, and then turned to Edgar. "Come on, son, try it yourself." Edgar, helping himself with his hands, began to carefully roll the pram up the makeshift ramp. A few minutes later, he and his vehicle were already at the door to the house. "Well, that's good," praised his neighbor. "Grandpa, are you here?" Came from behind the fence. "Let's go to lunch. I boiled some brine soup." Edgar turned his head at that voice, which sounded like the crunch of thin ice on a puddle. A girl in a striped jumper was waving from behind the gate. Her blonde curls were poking out from under her beret, and her bright blue eyes were visible, even at a distance of several meters. "My granddaughter," Elizabeth Norman nodded discreetly to Edgar. "She's in town for the weekend studying. I don't know who she's studying for," said the old man. "Come on, Grandpa, let's go. It's getting cold." The guest stomped her foot demandingly outside the gate. I'm coming. Why are you shouting?" The neighbor waved good-naturedly at her. "I'll go." "Edgar, say hello. I'll see you again. That beam under the roof is bad. It could use a change." Norman gathered the tools in a bag, waved to Edgar, and went out the gate to his granddaughter. The man thanked his neighbor for his hard work and suddenly realized that he couldn't stop thinking about Elizabeth, even though he hadn't even met her. April continued to bring warmth and wind. There were sparse gray-white piles of snow in the flower beds, and among them were sprouts of the first spring flowers sticking out of the ground. Edgar hadn't written to Amanda for a long time, but he was actively working on his book. The second notebook was already written. "Edgar, can you get to the shop by yourself? Are you out of salt?" Mother shouted from the kitchen. "I can't leave. The pies will burn and the soup will run away," Edgar said. The way to the grocery store was simple, a straight asphalt path about 250 meters long, with no steps and no potholes. "I can make it," Edgar said. He hastily put on his jacket, checked the change in his pocket, and rolled toward the gate. Glad that he could help at last. It was time to go for a walk. His mother looked at him from the window. The tires of the pram rustled quietly on the already dry asphalt. Edgar moved slowly, looking at the village. In the gray and dreary winter, it was depressing. But when the sun came out, the carved shutters and skates on the roof shone. In front of the yard's colored borders and future flower beds looked out. Quick sparrows were dragging grain from the chickens' feeders, chirping. Somewhere sheep barked. The noise pleased the heart, heralded the arrival of warmth to people and animals. Edgar got to the shop without any problems, bought salt and rolled back. Almost back to the house, he heard the pitiful, familiar meows from the roof of the neighbors. The man looked up. Bill was sitting on the roof. Edgar had seen from the window that the cat used to climb up there on scaffolding. The neighbors were repairing something in the attic, and the scaffolding had been up there most of the winter. But the repairs were over. The scaffolding was removed so as not to clutter up the flower bed in front of the windows. And the poor cat was trapped. There was no tree nearby, no lower roof, no suitable fence to climb down. Unhappy Bill climbed into the attic to the neighbors, fell asleep there the night before. and in the morning they cleaned up the scaffolding. And now the frightened animals, seeing the owner, shrieked at the top of their voices that the poor man was stuck. "How are we going to film you now?" "That's the problem." Edgar looked questioningly at the pet. He tried knocking and calling the neighbors, but they weren't home. Apparently, Edgar's conscience prevented him from calling his mother. The feeling of helplessness and inferiority came again. The man looked at the pram with dislike. If it hadn't been for her, I'd have climbed over the fence in no time, used the tools I had on hand to get up on the roof, and lowered Bleak down to the ground, he thought. A familiar ringing voice snapped Edgar out of his musings. Norman's granddaughter, Elizabeth, was standing nearby, looking up at the roof. "Yes, I wonder how to get it." Edgar nodded cautiously. "Well, you don't have much to think about," Elizabeth said. "Well, we can't leave the mustache in the lurch." She put the bag of food in Edgar's lap, rolled up her sleeves, and climbed over the fence to the neighbors. The man only clapped his eyes in amazement. The vivacious girl aroused in him a feeling of real admiration. Elizabeth walked round the house and found an old 3-step ladder by the shed. She shook the find happily, showing Edgar that she had an idea. The ladder was low enough to climb onto the roof, but high enough to reach her hands over the edge and grab the cat's paw. The frightened Bill clawed at the girl's hand, meowed, and looked around with bulging eyes. When the animal was on the ground, Elizabeth handed it directly into the hands of its owner, through the hole between the bars of the fence. Then she carefully carried the ladder back to its place and climbed back over the fence, as deftly as she had done the first time. There was no sign of the sudden intrusion. "You made us do a lot of work." She knelt down in front of Edgar and patted the cat's fur affectionately. "Thank you. I don't know how I would have got it myself." Edgar handed the girl a bag of groceries. "My name is Elizabeth," by the way she introduced herself. Obviously not, or he would have waited for another kind-hearted passerby. "And I'm Edgar." The man smiled slightly. "It's a good..." Amanda stretched out in bed, rays of sunlight falling through the window. The hands on the clock showed around 10. Michael wasn't around, he always left early. Apart from weekends, work was the most important lady in the real estate agency director's life. Amanda was in no hurry to get to work. She was already thinking of quitting in general. She was annoyed that Michael wasn't suggesting it. After all, in fact, they were already in a relationship, and he could also allocate some money for her. When colleagues called with questions about his readiness to show flats to buyers, Amanda always found excuses: illness, fatigue, busyness, urgent trip. "If he doesn't offer, then I have to quit," Amanda decided as she waited for the coffee machine to make coffee. She liked Michael's house much better than her husband's flat. It was quiet, spacious, and every little thing was taken care of by a robot Hoover. Dishes are washed by a machine, and everything else is automated to the max. It's also perfectly clean. Once a week, Michael had his house cleaned by a cleaning company. He couldn't stand dirt and piles of junk, and he preferred dry cleaning, where all the clothes were put on a hanger and returned perfectly ironed. Unlike Edgar, he was always on parade, not hanging around with tourists, looking after himself. It all appealed to Amanda. It was the way she'd always wanted to live. That was the level she aspired to. The first part of the plan had already been realized: she'd become the boss's mistress. The next part was to gradually accustom him to her in her personal space. Amanda was already looking ravenously at Michael's second car, calculating whether she needed a fur coat for the next season, and when it would be better to take a holiday. And then, when everything was already taken care of, she would quietly divorce Edgar. The girl's plans were Napoleonic. At work, they began to suspect a connection with the boss when Michael drove her a couple of times. Amanda did not answer the questions, but only joked, rolled her eyes. When it all came out, she wouldn't care. In the meantime, it would be better to keep the affair a secret, at least not to be jinxed. Amanda ate a leisurely breakfast, showered, put on makeup, hailed a taxi, and left the office in full parade. She was sure it would encourage Michael to do something more decisive, such as asking her to move in with him at last. "Greetings," Amanda said to the manager, raising an eyebrow in mild amazement. "Not for work anymore." She placed the application sheet in front of her. "So, are you going freelance or have you already found a better place?" the manager asked, putting the application in the folder. You could say that Amanda smiled enigmatically. She didn't bother with the detentions at her former job, hastily picked up her things from her desk, bade a dry farewell to her colleagues, and dashed out into the street. It was amazing the determination Amanda had awakened when the prospect of a relationship with a wealthy man loomed, and how she dreaded being left in poverty with a disabled husband. Amanda drove home, dropped off her belongings from work. Then she called her friend Camilla, and they went shopping together. The enterprising girl decided that a new set of pretty lingerie would soften the news of her dismissal from Michael. In the evening, Amanda met her lover in parade at his home and informed him of her decision. "Quit." "But why? You didn't seem to be loaded with cases, and you were always paid on time." The man was not naively surprised. "Why, Michael?" Amanda coquettishly sat on his lap. "To spend more time with you. After all, a well-slept, beautiful, satisfied woman is better than a tired working bee, isn't she?" "Yeah. Well, what makes you think you were?" Michael was genuinely perplexed. "That's how I felt." Amanda didn't like her lover's reaction. An awkward silence ensued. The man was the first to break it. "I wanted to talk to you about the May holidays too. I thought maybe we could go to the mountains, rent a remote cozy house. What do you think?" The word mountains almost made Amanda cringe. She was fed up with the mountains in her life with Edgar, and therefore quickly catching her face, the girl with the most innocent voice began to dissuade Michael from his decision. "Michael, it can still be cold in the mountains. I want to get warm already, you know." She slightly played with her eyebrows. "Maybe we should spend a little more and fly to a place where it's already warm enough. Lying on the beach is better than kicking up mud in the woods, don't you think?" "We could do that," the man agreed and reached for his laptop to look for a suitable offer. Amanda realized she'd won. Edgar was looking forward to the tea party with the neighbors, as if it were some kind of important event. He was also very excited by the return of the weak sensitivity in his legs. Had the hope of flying again risen from the ashes? Or at least to walk with his feet on the grass? Edgar longed for the paraglider, the mountains of his active life. He had buried it all when he got into the pram. But now there was a glimpse of a chance in the darkness that not all was lost. Edgar found the doctor's appointment folder, studied the instructions for physical therapy, and began to slowly exercise. Cassandra even let out a quiet tear of joy as she watched her son exercise. She tried to support him in everything, but not to push or nag him. She realized what Edgar was going through physically and mentally, and so she lagged behind with questions about Amanda, about motivation, about the flat. "Time will come on its own, everything will work out as it should," the woman sometimes said to herself in the evenings, tapping her knitting needles against each other. On a warm afternoon in mid-April, Norman and Elizabeth appeared on the doorstep of the house. The landlady invited them in, but the brisk grandfather waved them away, saying that first work, then tea and talk. So he surveyed the edge of the roof and set to work. Cassandra fussed at first, but then waved goodbye and went off to make dumplings. Edgar and Elizabeth set up on the front porch in case the good neighbor needed to fetch tools. "That's a great grandfather you have, Elizabeth," Edgar whispered in the girl's ear. "I don't remember my grandfathers. I was a little boy when they were gone. I guess I was lucky." Elizabeth nodded and smiled as she looked at her relative who was hard at work with a hammer. And yes, you're right, my grandfather is a good man. An example for the whole family in hard work and optimism. I can see that Edgar agreed. Do you look like him? Elizabeth tilted her head slyly and looked down at Edgar. She rested her hand on the wheel of the pram. What is it? She looked at the boy expectantly. Edgar was embarrassed for some reason. His heart was pounding like crazy. This simple and perky student caused in him a feeling similar to the first flight under the dome of a paraglider. You're light, witty, and kind, Edgar said in one breath. Elizabeth felt as if she were experiencing all the words in turn, and then nodded affirmatively, nodded a little pictorially, gave Edgar a playful tap on the shoulder, and laughed. An hour later, vanilla and cherries wafted from the open kitchen window. Cassandra leaned out the door and called out to everyone. Give up that roof, Norman. And you guys, come and eat your dumplings while they're hot. Edgar and Elizabeth were chatting on a bench near the porch and did not even hear the hostess' response at first. You, Cassandra, should have your stomach full of people when you're in the middle of work, the elderly neighbor said, fiddling with his tools. Grandfather, let's not go. It will get cold, Elizabeth said softly. She grabbed the handles of the pram with Edgar and boldly rolled it down the porch to the entrance. Don't do that, will you? I'll do it myself, he protested. Let me take care of you, Lisa giggled but didn't stop. When the two of them went to wash their hands in the back of the house, Cassandra stopped Norman, who was late for the young people, at the threshold and whispered, There's a flower bin bloom. I can't see it, he mumbled good-naturedly. Do you take me for an old fool? The neighbors smiled understandingly. When the whole company was gathered round the table, the plates were already steaming, fresh with jam, homemade dumplings with garden cherries, strong tea and sour cream so thick that a spoon could stand in it. Under the table, Bill grumbled. The cat nosed on one lap or the other, begging for treats. In the end, Elizabeth quietly gave the mustached cat one dumpling. Bill instantly dragged his prey outside with a proud look. Who is it that feeds the cat from the table? Cassandra was outraged. Cassandra, will you send them for a walk as punishment? Grandpa Norman winked at his granddaughter. Elizabeth and Edgar looked at each other at the same time. That's right, said the landlady. The weather's nice, there's no need to sit around. Go and pick a bunch of flowers. The goose meadow has already appeared. There's a whole meadow behind the village by the pond, and there's a path for the pram, just enough for Edgar to get through. After the meal, Elizabeth and Edgar, sensing a trick, but not seeing it, were outside the gate of the house and moved leisurely along the path. Can't you walk at all? I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that. It's inappropriate. It's okay, Edgar answered very calmly. The doctors say there's a chance, but I can't walk yet. At the same time, he remembered the tingling in his knees. He had recently started doing his own exercises, gymnastics, to restore sensation. But sometimes apathy overcomes me and I want to give up and accept everything he shared with the girl. They say that human possibilities are limitless, and it's all about desire. Elizabeth looked at the sun and then at Edgar. I'm studying marketing, but I want to work with people, with the masses. I feel a calling, but I don't know in what way. That's great, Edgar complimented her. In time, you'll realize where you're going. And you'll get back on your feet in time. I know you will. Elizabeth smiled and discreetly touched the man's shoulder. Edgar felt the warmth of her hand even through the thick sweatshirt. It remained there, even when the hand itself was gone. They talked and talked about plans and dreams, about the shortcomings of the student dormitories and strict teachers, about the countryside and the city, about the joys of being and imaginary problems. For the first time in many months after the accident, Edgar felt alive. If his legs would have obeyed, he would have run, spreading his arms out to the sides and putting his face to the wind. The pram hit a rock, rattling lightly. When the wheels shuddered, Elizabeth stopped. "Does it hurt?" No, he looked up at her, bewildered by the sudden joy. "I think I can feel my leg." Her eyes widened, and she squatted down beside him. She grasped her leg just above the knee and pressed lightly. The skin responded to Edgar with a barely perceptible but uncomfortable, dull pain, as if through a pillow. Barely, but it echoed. Edgar grabbed Elizabeth's hand. "I can feel her," he whispered. "I can feel her exactly." Elizabeth jumped up and laughed, then threw her arms around Edgar, a tear running down his cheek, either from joy or happiness, or maybe both. Amanda was dozing in her chair with her headphones on. Michael was sitting next to her, looking at something on his laptop. Clouds flashed in the window. The plane was carrying them home from their holiday. Why buy a car when you already have one? Amanda nodded down at the blue foreign car. Michael followed her gaze, pressed his lips together, and after a pause said, "The car's not running. I'm waiting for a new engine. Then I was planning to repair it, sell it, and invest the money in a project. And by the way, you don't even have any driving experience." "You can gain experience," Amanda said. "You can always sell it. I liked her so much. I could be your sober driver after all." Amanda was an excellent bargainer. She'd learnt while studying to be a translator that it was easier to ask for something than to make the effort and strain herself. And awkwardness could always be smoothed over with a woman's tricks. So Michael rubbed the bridge of his nose irritably with his fingers. "I don't drink, and even if I did, I could call a taxi. The car's not running, no one can drive it. When the right engine comes along, I'll order it. But until then, you'd better buy yourself a good pair of trainers," he said. The man stood up, took the mug with the rest of the coffee, and went back to his room, signaling that the subject was closed. Amanda pouted resentfully. The recommendation seemed insulting to her, considering that pretty shoes and stiletto boots had helped her initially win her lover. She was not refused directly, but rather harshly. She remembered the patient, kind Edgar, who, though he couldn't give her a car, had never refused her other more modest gifts. A few days passed. Amanda decided to ignore Michael's refusal and try to talk about the car again later. She pretended to be a diligent housewife, cooked a nice dinner, bought some good wine. The evening passed in a cozy atmosphere. Until Michael suggested watching a new film that showed the serene life of a family with 2 children. The father was playing frisbee with his son. The mother was teaching her daughter to play the piano. A golden retriever snoozed on the mat. "I always wanted a big family," 2 Michael said suddenly. "A son and a daughter. I even started this business so that the children would have enough to live on and not need anything." Amanda, who was lying on his lap, was slightly shaken, but she did not show it. So there it was, the perfect image of a spouse for Michael, whom he would agree to provide for without question, an educated, working mom. No, she's not going to be that. Wasting her youth and beauty on children. When there are so many countries, so many cool leisure options and ways to improve yourself. "I feel sick," Amanda said, jumping up and going into the kitchen. Suddenly, she had an amazing idea on how to get all the benefits of a lover without cheating on herself. She opened a bottle of mineral water, poured the falling liquid into a glass, and drank contentedly. The plan was simple and ingenious. Elizabeth would only come to the village on weekends. For the rest of the time, she had to attend classes. Edgar missed the girl, but tried to keep himself busy in her absence. He was especially focused on writing his book and doing exercises to develop his legs. Elizabeth supported his zeal in both endeavors. In the first 2 weeks of exercise, Edgar was able to wiggle his toes. In another week, he was able to slightly tilt his foot and tense his lower leg. With each new accomplishment, it was as if the motivation and strength for life was returning. May came. Birds sang, tulips, bushes, greenery, and fresh leaves bloomed. Cassandra was digging in the flower bed. She loosened the soil, removed fallen branches from the birch tree where red, yellow, and white tulip buds leaned. Next to them, crocuses climbed out in a row, and at the very border, blue caps of muscari buds. Bill was hanging around. The cat galloped around with his tail between his legs, jumped on the brick walls, hunted for soldier beetles that flew out from under the slate. Edgar sat in the pram by the porch, his eyelids closed, basking in the sun. Suddenly, someone's hands were on his eyelids. "What's the matter?" He stretched out, more amused than annoyed. "Elizabeth, did you think I wouldn't recognize you?" There was a giggle, and then Cassandra's chuckles. "I'm sneaking around like a gorilla." And he's like, "What's the big deal?" Elizabeth indignantly started tickling Edgar's ribs. He laughed immediately, shaking off the remnants of slumber. Cassandra laughed as well, watching the children fool around. When the fun subsided, they went inside to eat cold okroshka and drink dried fruit compote. At the table, Edgar discreetly put his hand on Elizabeth's arm. When his mother was at the cooker, pouring the compote, Elizabeth looked at him embarrassed, but did not remove her hand. Instead, she stroked his little finger with her thumb. It was a strange embarrassment to her normally perky nature. Edgar himself felt like a teenager, as if he were back at the institute and timidly seeking first dates with pretty female classmates. Cassandra saw what was going on at the table out of the corner of her eye, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she thought of something urgent to do outside, grabbed her head, and dashed out of the kitchen. "Elizabeth, I have to talk to you." Edgar began when he realized they were alone. The girl nodded and turned to face him, her whole body on the stool. "About what?" "About what's going on between us." Edgar sighed and took her hand again. "I like you a lot. I realize that we're not just friends anymore. You've become important to me, and you're helping me not to give up. I realize you don't want an invalid, but I'll tell you anyway, I'm married. Yeah, she dumped me like I wasn't worth having around, but officially, I'm still married." Instead of answering, Elizabeth moved closer and hugged him tightly around the neck. "Of course I need you for anything, and I'm sure you'll be out of that damn chair very, very soon," she whispered in his ear. Edgar's insides warmed. He hugged Elizabeth back, at the same time feeling the distinct tingling in his knees again as he pulled her to him. "You are an amazing person, with a good heart and a beautiful dream." Elizabeth looked into his eyes. "And I care first and foremost about how you feel, not what the papers say." The man smiled and hugged the girl again. "Let's get you back on your feet already." Elizabeth kissed him on the cheek. "Everything will work itself out from here." Amanda scrambled out of her seat and ran desperately to the lavatory. Under Michael's surprised gaze, they had just sat down to breakfast Saturday morning. They planned to drive to a business meeting and go for a walk afterwards. "Are you all right?" Michael knocked excitedly on the bathroom door. "Yeah, just dizzy all of a sudden with nausea," Amanda replied, carefully mimicking the appropriate sounds. She made some more noise with the cistern drain, the tap, splashed water on her face, and went out into the corridor. Michael looked at her with a mixture of joy and anticipation. "Are you pregnant?" he blurted out. "Oh, I don't know. I'll take a test today," Amanda clutched her forehead. "What's there to do?" Michael picked her up and sat her on the living room couch, fanning her. "It's pretty clear. You're sick of food and your face is all bloomy. And if that's the case, would you be glad?" Amanda pulled on the most naively righteous expression she could muster. Are you kidding? Of course I am. Michael knelt down in front of her. I've wanted kids for so long. And I applied for a second degree. What are we going to do? Take it back? Amanda changed from righteousness to a broken expression. Why take it back? You're a correspondence student. I'll pay for your education so you can work when the baby grows up, Michael assured her. Yeah, that's how I went to work. Amanda mentally regained her footing, of course. Good. I'll go to the doctor tomorrow and find out everything. She sighed, hugging a jubilant Michael. How to fake a pregnancy until the belly appeared. Amanda had thought through the nausea, mood swings, dizziness, and bouts of appetite. It wasn't a problem. A doctor she knew for a fee could write certificates and reports for the first time. But then Amanda was going to stage a miscarriage. The only problem was how to divorce Edgar discreetly, but stay in his flat. After all, the ambitious woman had plans to marry Michael, but he thought the flat belonged to Amanda. He never allowed her to move in. He wouldn't kick his baby mama out on the street, though, would he? There goes the puzzle, thought the cunning Amanda. The certificate was soon obtained. Michael was jubilant, developed a flurry of activity, and was already choosing a name for the future child. He immediately moved Amanda permanently to his place. In the evenings, he looked through prams and cots, endlessly discussed everything related to children. The girl nudged and herself tried to catch the moment to file for divorce. It remained to quietly finish the story with Edgar, so that it would be possible to marry Michael unhindered. There wasn't much time left, and every day counted. In the meantime, Amanda was taking full advantage of her position. She was capricious, demanded a personal masseur, demanded to order food at home, but at 3 o'clock in the morning asked to buy a ring or a handbag. Michael fulfilled all her requests without question, even made a separate bank card for Amanda. After all, the wishes of a mother and her child were a man's law. And no matter what, he liked Amanda, despite her temper. Are you sure? Elizabeth looked at Edgar very carefully. Maybe we should wait. I don't want anything to happen. Yes, I'm sure. Edgar leaned on the armrests of his chair as hard as he could. It was time to try it. They were both in the living room of the house, on the carpet. Elizabeth stood beside the pram and held out her arms to the man. Edgar began to carefully stand up. At first his legs obeyed him on his elbows, but somehow sluggishly, with a third of the strength that was usual for a healthy man. His knees bent like weighted hinges that hadn't opened a door in a long time. It's heavy, Edgar muttered. Elizabeth watched the boy eagerly. It's harder than learning to walk as a child. He put one foot down on the floor first, felt the shaggy pile of the carpet as if through a pillow. Then he put the other foot down. He had to make up his mind and let go of the armrests of the pram. Doubt overwhelmed the mind. Edgar closed his eyes and remembered his first paragliding flight. An eagle around the clouds that hugged the slopes affectionately, overgrown with pines, fir trees. He shivered at the long-forgotten sensations. He felt Elizabeth's support and tried to take a step. His leg felt like a stranger's, stricken with a cramp, but nevertheless he moved slowly forward. A movement, a step through the force, another step. His back was remembering what it was like to be straight. Edgar looked at his legs, scarred from his many extreme activities, and it was as if he was reliving them all a second time, standing here on the soft carpet in his own home. The man managed to take a dozen feeble steps with Elizabeth's encouragement and, tired, sat back in his chair. You're doing an incredible job, the girl hugged him. Let's go to the doctor. Let them record your progress. Maybe he will give some recommendations to make the process go faster. That's a good idea. But how do we get to the city and the hospital? Edgar nodded sadly at the still-needed wheelchair. Norman has a car. He can drive it, Elizabeth suggested. No, he won't, will he? Edgar waved his hands. Norman has already done so much for me. I can't. My conscience won't allow it. Oh, stop it, Elizabeth threw at him. That grandfather doesn't understand anything. Yeah, he's old and clueless. Edgar was embarrassed. But only if he agrees, don't insist. He grabbed the palm of Elizabeth's hand, who was about to go to the grandfather. The old Jigalanok drove measuredly over the bumps of the village road. Norman spun the steering wheel and talked about the years of dashing youth and work in the I filed for divorce, Amanda informed him briefly. I don't think I need to explain why or why not. You're a big, smart boy. You'll figure it out. Yes, I will, he confirmed his ex-wife's words. Good. I hope they do it quickly. I'll be out of the flat in a couple of weeks. Amanda hung up after that. Elizabeth heard the conversation, unlike Edgar. It's for the best. Don't be upset, she turned to Edgar and whispered. You said yourself that she was just a formality. You're right, the man nodded. Still, I loved this man once. The key word is once upon a time. Amanda tapped her fingers contentedly on the arm of the chair. Everything was going according to plan. Edgar had agreed to the divorce, even though he didn't have much of a choice. Michael adored her. The pregnancy legend was confirmed by a certificate. A personal bank card with enough money for every whim at any time of day. Awesome. What more could one want? Amanda felt like a queen, with everyone she'd used in her pursuit of the perfect life dancing in formation in front of her. So what do we have left? Staring pensively at the ceiling, she popped a cherry from the platter on the table. A car and an official marriage, she said to herself, spitting out the pit of the fruit. That's what we'll do tonight. In the evening, when Michael returned home, the first thing he did was to hug Amanda and stroke her belly. The girl was waiting for him. She fed her lover a delicious dinner, poured him wine, and gave him a massage. When Michael relaxed, Amanda went on the attack. Michael, I really want the baby to be born in a legal marriage. I grew up in a full family myself, and I think fatherlessness is unacceptable. I agree too, the man nodded. I wanted to discuss this issue too. Amanda stood waiting, like a hound waiting for the command to hunt down a bird for its master. Instead of answering, Michael reached into the pocket of his briefcase, pulled out a box, and placed it in Amanda's hands. I wanted to make it pretty, but since we're talking, why not? Michael pulled his lover to him, kissing her forehead. I agree, Amanda threw her arms around Michael, admiring the size of the stone in the ring. They decided to get married in 3 months. By the time of the wedding, Amanda had already planned to get rid of her ex-husband. After the ceremony and banquet, a week would pass and she would induce a miscarriage. The trap should slam shut in time and securely. I'll have to put on a few kilos for the good life, the girl smirked, mentally continuing to listen to Michael's musings about the wedding. Surprisingly, he was hardly interested in Amanda's personal life. Before she'd met him, she didn't even remember whether she'd told him about the divorce proceedings or not. Apparently, nonsense like an ex-husband was so insignificant to Michael that he preferred not to spend any time or attention on it. Amanda realized it was time to push harder. Michael, when my belly grows big, it will be hard for me to go to the hospital and to do things. She put her head on her lover's chest. Maybe you'll think about a car. And so I would take a couple of lessons with an instructor to refresh my knowledge in my head. What do you say? Of course, Amanda was lying. She didn't have anything to refresh her mind, because she'd got her license through a big acquaintance and obviously not for free. The young lady was not intimidated by the road, the police, or other drivers. The prestige of owning her own foreign car blinded her eyes. Maybe your words make sense? Michael wondered. He put his hands behind his head and wrinkled his forehead. Amanda held her breath and looked up from under her lashes. All right, he finally announced his decision. Only we're going to do things differently. I'll sell this car and buy you something more feminine, okay? Sure, thanks, honey. Amanda squealed in pleasure and started hugging Michael again, wondering if she should buy a new watch or bracelet in honor of such important events as marriage and the car. You should go into town and get that tramp stuff out of the flat. Cassandra put a plate of hot soup in front of her son. You've been divorced for a fortnight and you still haven't. Outside, the window smelled of lilacs. June was buzzing with young grass and summer rains. The sun was lavishing light on the land. Mum, I'm not quite confident enough to drive myself yet, Edgar replied, opening a jar of sour cream. Over the past month, the man had made noticeable progress in regaining his legs. He could get up and sit down with support, could walk slowly around the house with crutches, walked along the wall without support, and tried to keep his back straight. Could you ask Elizabeth? She goes into town every Monday anyway, if she could help you, the woman advised, sitting down across from him at the table. I don't feel comfortable. She's already here with me all the time, like a carer, Edgar mumbled. Cassandra put her hand on his palm. Son, this girl loves you. Unlike the city girls, you don't blow it. Such girls are worth their weight in gold. The boy looked at his mother in agreement. Edgar realized that everything had been clear between him and Elizabeth for a long time. So why did he hesitate and wait for something? Maybe the proverbial pram was still preventing him from stepping forward, even mentally. Many people have a bad first pancake, but that doesn't mean you can't try again. His mother walked round the table, stroked the back of his head, and went out into the room. Edgar ate his soup, then pulled out his phone and dialed Elizabeth's number. Hi, I was wondering if you'd go into town with me any day soon and check out the flat. The guy spoke, nervously twirling his spoon. For some reason, every interaction with Elizabeth gave him a pleasant shiver. Edgar was shy, lost, everything fell out of his hands, words were confused. He couldn't remember anything like this with any of his girlfriends. Did it mean what his mother was implying? Edgar didn't know. But each time Edgar waited for Elizabeth to come home from school more and more, and the joy of seeing her was brighter and brighter. Sure, let's go, the girl agreed. Are you sure you can manage without the pram? I have to, Edgar assured her. Good, Elizabeth's voice warmed. Then be ready on Saturday. I'm looking forward to it. Edgar pressed the button too soon, and he wanted to add kisses. But again, that childish embarrassment ruined it. How surprised he'd be to find Elizabeth feeling the same way, standing in the middle of the institute with a phone in her hand. I skipped the lab so I could come with you, Elizabeth blurted out when they were already on the train. Edgar looked at her in surprise. He had decided for the first time not to take the wheelchair with him and to use only crutches. Why? Instead of answering, Elizabeth climbed under his arm and tucked her nose into his side so that Edgar could only see the top of her head. He smiled into the measured, sleepy emptiness of the carriage, closed his eyes, and hugged Elizabeth tighter. The flat Edgar hadn't been to in almost 6 months echoed with the familiar turn of the key and the smell. The man breathed it in, standing on the threshold as if hesitant to enter. The smell reminded him again of times of traveling and flying. His paraglider was in a case in the cupboard on the balcony, his equipment in a rucksack, trekking boots, a camera for taking pictures from a height, a helmet. Amanda's belongings were not in the flat. Contrary to Cassandra's fears, she had taken every last jar, and judging by the footprints in the bathroom, quite recently. She hadn't even bothered to clean up. Edgar and Elizabeth ordered a snack to be delivered and began to tidy up. The man tried to do everything himself, but occasionally he stopped and rested. Elizabeth quickly tidied up the bathroom, washed the dusty dishes, wiped down the cupboards, vacuumed the carpets, and wiped down the mirrors. You're doing a great job. She praised Edgar as they sat down in the evening on the sofa in the living room with sandwiches and cups of tea. The doctor was right. You're getting better. I'm too well motivated, Edgar joked, glancing at Elizabeth. She was embarrassed and dropped the sausage in her lap. I'm very grateful for everything you do for me. Edgar took a piece from his sandwich and transferred it to the girl's sandwich. But I am very much attracted to the sky. I want to fly again and do what I love to do. I just don't know how. Edgar frowned. Aren't you afraid of hurting your back again? Elizabeth wrinkled her forehead too. She knew what had happened to Edgar's partner and their plane. Honestly, I'd go through it all again. Edgar looked at her defiantly. Why? Elizabeth bowed her head, perplexed. To meet you again. Edgar leaned down, quickly pulled the girl to him and kissed her. Amanda hurriedly paced across the bridge to the cafe for lunch with her friend. They had just toured a dozen bridal salons looking for a dress for her and her bridesmaids. It was the end of August. All wedding preparations were almost finished. A restaurant had been chosen. A photographer, a designer, and a host had been hired. The menu was determined and invitations to guests were sent out. Aren't you tired of pretending to be pregnant while sipping cold juice from a tube? Judy asked. I am. But what can you do? You want a beautiful life. Amanda grinned. You've got Michael, I'll give you that, she said dreamily. Handsome, with money, established. He's got it all. Not like your former test pilot. You don't say. Amanda nodded, pushing her plate away. The man's in his 30s, and he's still in the mountains, doing crazy things. It's all right, they're divorced now. Forgotten like a terrible dream. Her friends laughed. How far along are you? Judy nodded at Amanda's belly and grinned. I'm in my 5th month of eating like a mad woman, and I've already gained 3 kilos. How can I lose it all? It's okay, 1 more week and you'll have a tragic drama. Amanda grinned. Where do you get the paperwork from Michael to believe? Judy whispered. Camila, my friend, does it for me for a small fee. Amanda replied in her tone of voice. We should go to her today, by the way. Michael wants the results of the ultrasound. Paul wants to know the baby. She grinned again. You're a brilliant woman, Amanda. She admired her friend. I wouldn't dare do that. If you want to live, you have to be able to move. Amanda shrugged her shoulders. The girls paid for their lunch and said goodbye. Amanda got behind the wheel of a brand new red sedan, and John waited for a taxi. In her head, Amanda was already imagining the wedding ceremony, figuring out how her dress would fit, what angle would be best to take pictures from. She ordered an exclusive bouquet of terry pale lilac roses from the florists and anticipated her image with it in such dreams. The girl drove up to the clinic car park. After a small formalities, Amanda was already sitting in the office of gynecologist Camila. The nice conversation was interrupted by a phone call. Sweetheart, where are you? Michael answered the phone to greet her. I'm at my doctor's office. When I get off, I'll pick up the results and go straight home. Oh, great, I thought I'd make risotto. I asked if you could have it, because there's wine in the recipe. Michael asked worriedly. Okay, I'll be sure to ask. Amanda jabbed her finger at the screen without looking and slipped her smartphone into her purse. He's worried about my pregnancy. She wrinkled her nose and made an inverted comment. Amanda drove home in high spirits. She picked up the wedding glasses from the salon, packed them carefully in a box, and was pulling into the car park of Michael's house by 7 p.m. That's odd. I thought he wanted to make risotto. Amanda turned up her nose, kicking off her shoes in the hallway. The house smelled ordinary instead of Italian. And it was too quiet, no sound of rattling pots, no clatter of knives from the kitchen. The girl went into the hall and saw Michael sitting in the armchair. Did you decide to order food from the restaurant? Amanda tried to joke. Michael looked at her glumly. Give me the car keys. Why? Amanda raised an eyebrow in bewilderment. Michael sucked in air through his nose, exhaled. You're going to give me the car keys, then you're going to go to the first floor. Gather all your things, call a taxi, and get the hell out of my life. His voice rumbled so loudly that it echoed in every corner of the house. Amanda squirmed cowardly, her eyes watering. She tried to open her mouth. Michael, what's wrong? The man stood up and roughly snatched the keys from her, his hands shaking. And tell your doctor I'll make sure she's not allowed to practice medicine. Or better yet, sue her, Michael said coldly, looking her in the eye. Amanda collapsed onto the carpet between the chairs. Her ears rang in her ears as reality rained down on her unprotected skin, burning her with the pain of hot needles. Michael squatted down beside her, took her chin, and turned her to face him. Were you trying to get a warm place for yourself at my expense? I had the wrong time and made the wrong call. Yay. How embarrassing. It was so stupid to think of it, he said with a sneer. Amanda burst into tears of shame. But Michael didn't care anymore. She remembered that night like a blur. She stuffed her things into suitcases and bags in 15 minutes, not even trying to apologize, even though it was pointless. Offended Michael, the director of the real estate agency, made caustic jokes about her, and then he poured himself a glass of wine and drank in silence, watching her ex-lover Amanda frantically packing her belongings. Before he left, he took away all her expensive gifts, watches, jewelry, branded items. Amanda walked out of the gate with exactly the same set of things she'd come here with a few months ago. So are you ready? Elizabeth stood in front of Edgar and held his hands tightly. Ready, my captain, the man mockingly put a hand to his helmeted head. The paraglider takeoff pad spread out before them, and beyond it thundered mountains of unbelievable beauty in the autumn landscape. The slopes were drenched in all the colors of the sun's palette, from ochre to purple. The bushes of wild buckthorn shone with beads of miniature berries. Black thorns did not argue with them with their purple cherry leaves. Gray-brown stones, as if old wise men, soothed the riot of autumn colors. It was the end of September. On the bald slope away from the site, the last emerald lizards basked and rare butterflies fluttered. When you go to land, don't spread your legs too far apart. We'll know when it's time, said Terrence, adjusting his harness. Oh, come on. What's the holdup? Thomas, the instructor who had once trained John, peered out from behind the passenger cradle. He won't be flying himself until next season at the earliest. I'm in charge for now. All right, stay out of this. Terrence held his palms up and moved away from the runway with Elizabeth. Let's go down the incline and I'll pick you up, Thomas commanded John. Let's go. John gripped the safety harness tighter and sped forward. Elizabeth gasped when the wind caught the glider and it began to rise upwards, swaying weakly. Terrence put his palm to his forehead, shielding his eyes from the sun, and shouted approval. All right, let's go, Elizabeth agreed. Good. I'm worried about him anyway, she rubbed her fingers together nervously. Come on, Terrence patted her on the shoulder. Thomas is the best of the best. He'll bring your husband back to Earth safe and sound. Elizabeth just looked up at the bright dome of the paraglider, which had already risen even higher. Let's go to the lower ground. They'll land there, Terrence nodded to the gangway. When will you fly? She asked. I'll wait until Edgar is fully recovered, Elizabeth replied. He's the only one I trust. And it's so nice and amazing and beautiful here. She spread her arms and breathed in the still warm, clean air, but with a hint of autumn chill. Terrence laughed. You haven't been rafting with us or riding quad bikes in the mud. There you can feel all the charms of wild tourism. I think that everything is still ahead of us. Elizabeth smiled back. Of course, we will definitely take you with us if you want. First we'll get to work, and then we'll send one on tour with people," laughed the cheerful Terence again. No. I'm only going with my husband." Elizabeth shook her head. They walked to the lower ground, where they found a thermos of herbal tea and sandwiches in the tents. A lot had changed in Edgar and Elizabeth's lives over the past summer. They sold their flat in the city and bought a smaller place away from the center. And the remaining money was spent on a second-hand minibus in good condition. Terence did not have to be persuaded for a long time. He was happy to return to the company and to travel to the mountains again. He only demanded a good insurance policy in case of unforeseen circumstances. Elizabeth took over the information part of the company, dealing with advertising, answering the phone and keeping the documentation. Edgar was not yet able to fly as an instructor. He had not yet fully recovered from his injury. But he was happy to tell tourists about the coolest places to visit, gave a copy of his book with an autograph to the most curious. But the biggest change was in Elizabeth and Edgar's relationship. They were now officially married. There was no lavish wedding, no expensive gifts, no typical wedding dress. The newlyweds signed, sat with their loved ones, and drove off to the mountains that same evening. By the time of the wedding, Edgar was already walking with a cane and did not need crutches, much less a wheelchair. The doctors applauded him and called it nothing short of a miracle. "It's so good to be here again, and to have everything back to the way it was." Terence stretched noisily with a satisfied face. "Almost the same old," Elizabeth corrected him. "I'm sorry," generously Terence made a conciliatory gesture with his hand. Two women were returning from the store with heavy bags. They lived in the neighborhood, and it was a long walk from the store. But that didn't upset the neighbors, who were known in town as Mrs. Jessica and Mrs. Carolyn. They had much to discuss. Mrs. Jessica began her story. "Well, she came back at 3 o'clock in the morning. Stephen brought her back and picked up his granddaughter from the hospital on the way." Mrs. Caroline gasped. "What kind of baby did she have? The third or the fourth?" "Carolyn, don't distract me. You're distracting me. Are you interested or not?" Mrs. Jessica asked. "Let me finish. Anyway, Stephen brought her in at 3 in the morning with her newborn granddaughter. And she has a belly, the granddaughter." "Come on. Did the granddaughter give birth on her own?" "Her belly, did she give birth?" "Yes, Carolyn." Mrs. Jessica exclaimed in delight. The news was out of the blue. The whole town knew the Zvonarov family. However, they did not have many residents, and everyone knew everyone. But the daughter was something of a local celebrity. "At last her grandmother will stop being so uppity," said Mrs. Caroline gloatingly. "She's been playing the blue-blooded girl for years. She's lived here for years, and when you look at her, you can tell she's from the city." Mrs. Jessica laughed. "You don't say. She's been walking around town all her life, sticking her nose up, like she's better than us. And she's got a granddaughter herself. Didn't she leave to go to college, to study veterinary medicine? So we learned." The neighbors laughed again. "Who's the father?" Mrs. Carolyn asked. Mrs. Jessica waved her hand. Look for the wind in the field. What a thing to do. By the time they reached their homes, the fresh gossip had been discussed on all sides. But the women already knew that as soon as they got home and put the groceries they had bought on the refrigerator shelves, they would each pick up their cell phones and start calling everyone they knew. So soon the whole town would know about it. Jessica has loved animals since she was 5 years old. She found a sparrow with a broken wing in the street. Probably one of the local boys had hit it with a slingshot. But the bird managed to fly away from its offender and get to the lilac bushes under which the girl was playing. Jessica brought the sparrow to her grandmother. "What do you have there, Jessica?" Melissa asked. Instead of answering, the granddaughter held out her hands. The sparrow. Let's have a look. Grandma picked up the injured bird and carried it to her desk. She laid down an old, clean white towel, put on her glasses, and scrutinized the sparrow. Jessica had been quietly following Melissa the whole time. She knew her grandmother wouldn't send her away, but she didn't want to disturb her. "Aren't you afraid?" Melissa asked. No, Jessica answered boldly. Her grandmother looked at her fondly. Huge blue eyes, black hair braided into two pigtails. She looks just like her mother at that age, Melissa thought. She said nothing aloud, but smiled. "Look," she said to her granddaughter, "I'm going to take a look at him. You have to be careful. I will touch it very gently with my fingertips. See?" "Yes, Grandma." "Well." His head, torso, and legs are intact. The left wing is intact, but the right wing is bruised. Will you fix him, Grandma?" "I'll do my best, honey. We'll have to fix the wing so it'll reattach. And we've got to get this poor bastard into a warm, dry place, fed and watered. You'll help me take care of him, won't you?" "Yes, Grandma." Jessica was happy. They got that sparrow out, as well as many other animals after it. Melissa had been a veterinarian all her life. Not in this town, though. She came here 5 years ago with little Jessica in her arms. Before that, Melissa had lived in the big city, where she ran the largest veterinary clinic for many years. She was the most well-known and sought-after specialist. So much in demand that she had no time at all to raise her own daughter. With her husband, Melissa divorced when James was only 10 years old. The husband simply could not withstand the presence of such a strong and intelligent woman. But Melissa did not care. She was all about work. And when she realized that James had grown up, it was too late. Her son had already gotten mixed up with bad company. He was hardly ever home and was dating Ricky the musician, who was 10 years older than him. When Melissa found out, James was already expecting a baby. "Are you going to have a baby?" "You're going to have a baby?" his mother yelled at him. "Yes, Ricky loves me. This baby came out of love, unlike how you and Daddy had me." Melissa gasped in indignation. "You're just a kid yourself. Where will you live and what will you live on? He's a penniless musician. He's talented. It's just that you don't know anything but your horses and dogs. We can manage without you." "Great. Go to your musician and go." That day, James packed up and moved out of his mother's house. And a few months later, Melissa was awakened by an early doorbell. On the doorstep lay a baby wrapped in several blankets and a note: "You were right. I'm too young to be a father, and going on tour with an infant is inconvenient. If you don't want to raise him, give him to an orphanage. I don't care." When Melissa read that, it was as if something inside her broke. Over the next week, she quit her job, sold her city apartment, and bought a house in a remote village. She figured she had enough savings for the rest of her life. Melissa was determined not to make the same mistake a second time. She would raise her grandson in love and understanding. He would grow up to be a good boy, kind, gentle, affectionate. He will not throw himself at the first musician he meets, because he lacks love from people close to him. Melissa will do anything to replace his father and mother. "I want to be a veterinarian too, just like you," Grandma Lillian declared when she turned 10. Melissa smiled. "Of course, I'm very glad you want to follow in my footsteps. But there are so many exciting new professions in the world. You don't have to be a veterinarian. You can become anything you want: a teacher, an astronaut, an actress." The granddaughter shook her head. "I love animals, and I love it when they get well." Grandma thought for a moment. "Good. I'll try to teach you everything I know. But when you grow up and finish school, you will still have to go to the city, enter the university and study there for a few years." The girl listened to her attentively. "Okay, Grandma," she said with a seriousness unusual for a 10-year-old child. "I will study with you and then at the university." Melissa smiled and nodded. From that day on, she began to make contacts with the villagers. Previously, she only interacted with people out of necessity, when she needed to buy milk, eggs, cottage cheese, meat, and other necessary food and non-food items. However, when the former head of the city's main veterinary clinic realized that she would have to teach her granddaughter the ins and outs of her beloved profession, she seriously reconsidered her attitude. It became apparent to Melissa that a lot of hands-on training would be required. Just the occasional sparrow and frog won't do it, she thought. It started with a trip to the local store. Normally, the woman would try to get her shopping done quickly and go home. But this time, Melissa lingered. "I've had bitter milk for 2 weeks. Can you believe it?" She heard Paul at the counter. "Yeah. Oh, that's too bad. We've always bought from you. It was the best." "You don't say. We don't know what to do with it, even if we cut it up. But it's a pity. She's a young cow, not even 5 years old." "Did you by any chance change the place where she was grazing in recent weeks?" The women stopped talking and stared at Melissa. In 10 years, they'd grown accustomed to the strange newcomer. Although she had lived in an old house on the edge of the village for a long time, she had never done anything bad. They still called her Townie behind her eyes. Her big eyes. Lillian's granddaughter went to school with the other children and was no different from them. But her grandmother Melissa always showed that she was different. She never said hello to anyone, never talked to anyone. She never invited anyone to visit her. That's why the day when she suddenly spoke to the locals herself went down in the history of the village. "Yes," said the landlady when she had recovered from her surprise. "She ate all the grass in her usual place. And my son Paul found a new field." Melissa nodded. "Take me there." "Oh." The landlady looked at her questioningly. "I rode my motorcycle here. It has a sidecar. If you're not afraid, I'll take you." "Great." When they got to the field, Melissa got off the bike and looked at the ground. "Here," she said triumphantly, clutching a blade of grass in her hand. "This is the cause of your cow's bitter milk. It's not the most common plant in these parts, but there's quite a lot of it in this clearing. Let your son Paul graze the cow elsewhere, and after a while her milk will be as sweet as before." News of Melissa's talent spread through the village in a matter of hours. The very next day, people came to see her about her sick horse. Then she was called to a neighbor whose chickens had suddenly stopped laying. Then she was asked to find out why a 6-month-old piglet had suddenly stopped gaining weight. And everywhere Melissa took her granddaughter, Lillian. Strangely, but the little fragile girl was not frightened by the huge animals, nor by what her grandmother sometimes had to do with them. "Yeah, toughness of spirit. You're like me," Melissa said once when her granddaughter helped her deliver a cow. Lillian looked at her in surprise. "We're helping animals, Grandma," Melissa said. "That's right." Lillian's education was a success. When the girl turned 15, Melissa started sending her alone for simple cases. When she realized that Lillian was doing well, she began entrusting her with more difficult tasks. Everyone in the village already knew that the girl would finish school and go to the city to study veterinary medicine. "You'll come back to us later, won't you?" Aunt Caroline once asked Lillian. The girl shrugged her shoulders. "I guess I like it here." "You should find a good husband," Aunt Caroline said thoughtfully. Lillian blushed. It was too early to think about that. The woman waved her hand. "It's never too early to think about it. Stephen's granddaughter has had her second, and she's only 3 years older than you. I mean, look at my youngest, Ryan. He's a hell of a guy." Lillian didn't bother to say that he was famous for his promiscuity and even more for his bragging. "I'm just thinking about school for now," she said firmly. "Well, you're just like your grandmother," sighed Aunt Caroline. "Stephen's been trying to hit on her for 2 years now, and she's still not getting it. They're such a loving family." Lillian thought, but didn't say anything out loud. Even though both Melissa and her daughter were respected in the village, they were still not considered completely their own. The good vets help everyone, but they keep to themselves. Melissa doesn't like to receive guests, and Lillian is unapproachable to the village boys. So what if she's a pretty girl? No, she's a pretty girl. Of course, fragile as a reed. Big blue eyes, long black hair, thick, fluffy eyelashes. But is it really worth it to play hard to get? Lillian walked to the store. Of course, it wasn't healthy to carry heavy things when you were 9 months pregnant, but they were almost out of food at home. And Grandma hadn't been feeling well lately. Age was taking its toll, after all. Of course, Lillian noticed how curious the villagers looked at her. The way the women smiled wryly when Lillian entered the store. They whispered as if she couldn't hear anything. Lillian didn't react in any way. "A loaf of white bread, please," she said to Aunt Patricia, the perky little clerk who had worked in the store as long as Lillian could remember. "Is she pregnant?" said Aunt Patricia. "What else?" "A pack of matches, a pack of butter, macaroni and oatmeal cookies." "I'll be right there, baby. How are you doing?" "Baby?" Aunt Carolyn's voice came from behind Lillian. "I'm fine," Lillian answered calmly. "How's school?" The woman's voice was clearly sarcastic. "I'm a correspondence student." "It's fine," Lillian replied calmly. "Oh yeah, who's the father?" "Daughter." "Aunt Jessica couldn't take it anymore," she said. "Thank you, Aunt Patricia, goodbye." Lillian handed over the money, took her shopping and left. She didn't dignify Aunt Jessica with an answer. What kind of girl doesn't want to come clean? Playing the innocent. "We all know she's promiscuous," Aunt Carolyn said at her. Aunt Jessica shrugged her shoulders. "What about me? Has everyone seen her? Where's the husband? No husband. So she's out." As she left the store, Lillian wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. It's all right, she'll get over it. The stares, the conversations, the questions, not the worst of it. She could take it all. The main thing is that Grandma Melissa is on her side. Lillian got into veterinary school without any problems. She and her grandmother decided in advance that the girl would study at the correspondence department. But only for a year longer, Melissa said. "You'll get the same diploma. And we need it for work. You learn the theory on your own, and I taught you everything I know." Of course, it's understandable that after all these years, a lot of new things have come up. But that's okay. If you know the basics, you'll figure it out quickly. Lillian smiled at her grandmother. "You always say the most important thing is practice." Melissa nodded. "And you've had plenty of it. And to make it even more, I asked one of my former subordinates to hire you at his clinic. Will you help a young but very talented doctor there and study in your spare time?" Grandma asked. "Okay," Grandma Lillian replied. Studying came easily to her. Of course, a lot had changed since Grandma had been in charge of the clinic. Veterinary science had advanced a lot, but it was still much easier for Lillian than her classmates who didn't have the same experience. Peter, her grandmother's former apprentice and subordinate, and now the director of the clinic himself, welcomed Lillian with open arms. "Hello, hello, daughter." He shook her hand affectionately and invited her to sit down. In the pictures her grandmother had shown her, Peter had been a thin, short guy with funny round glasses. Now he was wide, had laser vision correction, and had grown a thick, dark red beard. "How's Melissa?" he asked. We were all shocked when she suddenly announced that she was quitting her position as head of the hospital and resigning. Lillian knew why her grandmother had suddenly resigned from such an important position, but she would hardly be happy if her granddaughter talked about their personal life. "It's all right," Lillian said. "She asked me to give you her regards and said she was very proud of you." Peter smiled embarrassedly and for a few seconds looked like the young man in the photo from 20 years ago. "Thank you. That's very nice to hear," he said. "I take it Melissa still prioritizes hands-on learning?" Lillian smiled. "That's why I enrolled as a part-time student." "That's actually a wise decision," Peter said. "Well, will you be working as an assistant to one of our doctors? I'm sure he'll teach you a lot." The doctor was only 8 years older than Lillian. However, the girl immediately noticed that he was respected by the rest of the clinic staff, and she liked Nicholas at first sight. Tall, blonde-haired, with blue eyes, he seemed to always be in a good mood and showed kindness to both people and animals. He took the news that he would now have a new assistant quite calmly. "Well, Jessica," he said cheerfully, "we'll see how you do in the field." "I'll do my best," Lillian replied. Working with Nicholas was interesting. He had an easy rapport with both the animals and their owners. Lillian noticed how carefully he took a history, how detailed his examination was. "It's easier with sick people," he explained to Lillian. "They can tell you everything in words, but with animals we can only focus on what the owners notice. Not all of them are very observant, so you should help them to ask how the animal's behavior and habits have changed. And of course, the examination of the pet itself gives a lot." Lillian listened attentively and nodded. "By the way, you are very good at manipulation," Nicholas praised her. "Injections, bandages, and everything else. Where'd you learn that?" "My grandmother is a veterinarian," Lillian answered. "She used to take me with her whenever someone in the village asked her to help." "Oh, you have more experience than me," exclaimed the doctor cheerfully. Lillian smiled embarrassedly. "I've been observing more only for the last 3 years. She began to trust me. Various uncomplicated cases. And in the village our patients were mostly cows, horses, pigs, chickens, goats, dogs, and cats too, but much rarer." "Well said, Nicholas. We rarely have cows and chickens. But your experience is excellent. I can see that you are good at what you do. Just study hard, do well in your exams. I'll teach you the rest." He gave her a list of current textbooks and websites. "That's what you have to read. Not to the fact that half of what you'll learn at the Institute is already outdated, and another quarter will be outdated by the time you get your diploma." "That's sad," Lillian said. The doctor shrugged. "That's life. By the way, if you want, I can give you another part-time job. It is in our clinic you will perform manipulations for animals whose owners agree to bring them to us every day. Which, for example, to put IVs, shots, many do it themselves," said Nicholas. "And I understand that. After all, everyone's budget is different. In this case, your task is to explain to the owner in as much detail as possible how to do it safely, painlessly, and effectively for the pet. Understood?" Lillian nodded. "But some owners are willing to pay for comfort and safety and trust their pet only to us. Sort of like a daycare center. There's a nurse shortage in the evening." "Thank you," the girl replied. "I would love to take this part-time job." Most of the people who came to the day hospital were IVs. Lillian quickly learned to find the veins and carefully placed the catheter. The owners of the animals were very satisfied. Lillian even almost became friends with one of the owners. Tara was a sweet little woman of about 36. It was immediately obvious that she was a very wealthy woman, expensive brand-name clothes, well-groomed, manicured face and nails, small purses that changed every time she visited. She had a long red cat named Puppeteer, who was dear to the mistress and her husband, about whom she constantly said, Alex and I have been married for 13 years, she told Lillian, stroking the cat as he lay under the IV and showing her how much he disliked this pastime. We got him the first week after we got back from our wedding trip. We came out of the store and he was sitting on the porch hungry. Small, scared. Now he looked as well-fed and well-groomed as possible, with a long, silky coat. And he's been with us ever since, Tara continued. He's like a child to us. Lillian nodded. When she had lived in the countryside, she had been used to a very different way of treating animals. Yes, the owners loved their pets, but they were more practical. If cows got sick, it potentially threatened the family with the lack of milk, cottage cheese, sour cream, and meat that the cow was once supposed to go to. Horses were needed for transporting goods, cats for catching mice. Dogs guarded the house. Chickens laid eggs. And here in the city, animals had little practical use, but were treated almost like members of their family. At first, Lillian didn't understand it, although she loved animals herself. But gradually, talking to the owners, she realized that behind each cat, dog, parrot, there was a personal story. Kuklavad the cat was very seriously ill. He had to go on drips for 3 weeks. And since the cat was not easy, Lillian tried not to go far away during the IVs. So she got to know Tyr and her family more and more. He is like a child to us, the owner of the ginger cat often repeated. And one day she decided to explain to the girl in detail. My husband and I have wanted to have a child for a long time, she confessed. We have been trying for almost 10 years, but it still doesn't work out. I'm very sorry for you, Lillian said. But you can still do it. Don't worry, you're so young. Tara suddenly shrieked. No, she shouted almost desperately. We've tried so many times. We've been tested from head to toe dozens of times. I've done IVF 7 times. Nothing works. She cried. Lillian was confused. She didn't expect that the treatment of the cat. I'm satisfied with the amount of work I have now, Lillian explained. I sit with you at the reception in the morning, and in the evening I earn practical skills. In between, I try to study. I don't have a lot of free time. The doctor nodded. I understood that. But maybe you, Lillian, do have some free time sometimes, don't you? He looked pitifully at the girl with his expressive brown eyes. She sighed. Yes, I have this Saturday off, but I wanted to see my grandmother. I haven't seen her in 3 months and she wanted to come to town. I need to get some medicine for the animals. She still works as a veterinarian for you, unofficially, Lillian replied. There's just no one else in the village to do it. I understand, Nicholas nodded. An interesting idea suddenly occurred to him. If you want, I could introduce you, Lillian said. Nicholas hummed in surprise. That's an unexpected offer. But if my presence won't make you uncomfortable, I'll accept it. Good, Lillian said. Then it's a deal. At first, the grandmother was skeptical about meeting her granddaughter's boss. But after chatting with Nicholas for about half an hour, Lillian noticed her grandmother's face soften. It's nice to know how far science has come since the last time I worked, Melissa said. I thought in so many years I'd make my granddaughter an almost ready veterinarian. Turns out she has to start from scratch. Nicholas smiled and shook his head. Melissa, you've done a wonderful job of preparation. Believe me, if I had a grandmother like you, I'd be running a clinic today. Still, the basics of anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, disease pathology, and many other processes have not changed over time. You've also given Lillian a tremendous practical background. Melissa nodded favorably. Of course, she was pleased to hear that. She looked at her granddaughter with a smile, who smiled back at her. Well, Lillian's experience in the village is pretty specific, she said. When I first came there after practicing in a city clinic for so many years, I had a hard time too. Don't you want to go back to the city? Nicholas asked suddenly. It must be hard for you in the village alone right now, isn't it? Melissa shrugged. I've gotten used to it over the years, and she's not as old and helpless as she looks at first glance. At least the local grandfathers still come to me to ask me to marry them. Lillian laughed. That's a lot of wow, Grandma. Melissa shrugged and stood up. All right, you're young people. Have fun, she said. I've got a bus to catch. Are you upset? Lillian asked. I don't want to. It's too late to go back, said Grandma. But it's getting dark early. I'll take you to the train station, Nicholas offered. After they had seen the grandmother off, the doctor asked, Do you want me to drive you home, or can we walk some more? Lillian rubbed her eyes sleepily. I'm going home. I'm tired and I want to sleep. Don't be offended. He smiled. I'm not offended. It was nice to meet your grandmother. She really is a great woman. Lillian smiled. She really liked you too. After 3 weeks, the course of IVs ended. Nicholas examined him, carefully read the results of control tests, and announced to the owners that the cat is perfectly healthy. Of course, he is no longer a boy, said the doctor, but for his age is holding up very well. Diet I wrote you. If anything, you know our address. Thank you very much, Nicholas said, Tara's husband. A nice, quiet man in a business suit. On Christopher's lap lay a caged treasure, which he held gently with one hand, and with the other hand he tenderly squeezed his wife's palm. Lillian suddenly turned to the girl. I have a favor to ask of you. Could you leave me your phone number? If you don't want to, I'll understand. Lillian looked at the doctor in surprise, but replied, Okay, I'll text you now. Tara called her that same evening. Lillian, I told my husband about how you took care of our kitty, and he wants to thank you. No, you don't have to, Lillian replied, embarrassed. I was just doing my job. And you helped me a lot, said the cat's owner. So please don't say no. We just want to invite you to dinner. Lillian thought that perhaps that was something she could agree to. Okay, the girl replied. Where do I have to go? What are you talking about? Tara exclaimed. Our driver will pick you up. You don't have to worry so much. Believe me, it's not hard for us. Especially since we live in the countryside, it's impossible to get there any other way. Good, Lillian agreed. Of course, she was a little worried, especially when she got into the luxurious black car with tinted windows. Hello, Lillian said timidly to the driver, a huge, pumped-up man in a black suit, who opened the door for her and helped her to get in. The man nodded without changing his expression. Why did they need this dinner, Lillian thought. A simple thank you would have sufficed. Especially since they gave me a huge fruit basket, which I shared with the entire clinic that same day. Nicholas got an expensive whiskey. I won't be as generous as Lillian and keep it, the doctor stated. Just kidding. We'll open it at the New Year's Eve party. His co-workers were outraged, but Nicholas was adamant. Where here the driver's voice sounded, breaking Lillian out of her thoughts. The man got out quickly, opened the door, and gave her his hand. The girl thanked him embarrassedly. Shall I go in there? Lillian asked timidly, as they stopped in front of the high marble porch of a magnificent mansion. I'll show you out. As they walked along, Lillian was surprised to think that she hadn't realized how rich the owners were. The cat knew it was clear they had money. Surely she knew how much it cost for 3 weeks of IVs to save a cat from a serious illness. But that car, the driver, the country mansion behind the high fence. Lillian, are you here? Tara happily ran up to her and hugged her as if they were old friends, despite the posh surroundings. The woman kept herself very simple, which made Lillian like her even more. Christopher was here, too, only he kept a more reserved demeanor than his wife. He smiled at Lillian and nodded. "Let's go to the dining room," he said as his wife opened her arms. Yes, of course, Tara answered him. The three of them walked into the huge dining room. Lillian looked at the long table with a white lace tablecloth filled with many dishes of food. She felt uneasy. She turned to the owners of the house and said timidly, "I'm sorry in advance, but I don't know anything about cutlery." Christopher shrugged. "What's there to know? You eat liquids with a spoon and solids with a fork. And if you mean those houses where they serve 10 kinds of cutlery for every meal, that's not us." "We're simple people," Christopher said, putting his arm around his wife and kissing her gently on the temple. She smiled softly and invited Lillian to the table. After a few minutes, the girl was completely relaxed. In their company, it seemed as if she was sitting with old pals. The couple talked about the cat. "We decided to buy him a new scratching post," Tara said. "The old one is already scary to look at. Seva and I spent a week choosing one. And this bully began to tear it the first night. I had to return the old one." Lillian smiled. There was a pause, and the girl noticed how the couple suddenly looked at each other. They clearly wanted to say something else, but it was as if they were working up the courage. Finally, Tara, squeezing her husband's hand, turned to Lillian. "If we're being honest, we didn't call you here just to thank you for saving our favorite cat. Of course, that too. But our main purpose was different." Lillian froze. "I'm listening to you," she said. Tara took a deep breath, and in one breath she blurted out, "We're asking you to be a surrogate mom for our baby." Oh, was all Lillian could say. This is all very unexpected. Christopher entered the conversation. "We realize that this is a very unexpected offer, but please don't be in a hurry to refuse." "Yes, we've given it a lot of thought," Tara said. "And please at least hear us out." They looked at Lillian with such a pleading look that she realized she couldn't refuse the request. "I told you that we've been trying for years to have a child," Tara began. "But all those attempts were unsuccessful." Her voice trembled, and her husband put his arm around her shoulders. "The doctors said we're both healthy, except that my body can't carry a baby, so surrogacy is my only chance." "But why did you choose me?" Lillian couldn't take it anymore. "You hardly know me." Tara shook her head desperately. "No, I've spent enough time with you to know what kind of person you are." "You're a very nice girl," Tara said. "Most importantly, I trust you completely. That's probably the most important criteria for us." Christopher nodded. There's probably something I should explain. I'm a fairly public person who is involved in business and politics. Unfortunately, we are still condemning this way of having children. So it's important for us that no one knows about it. And I trust you completely," Tara repeated. "But pregnancy was not part of my plans," Lillian said. "I have work, school." The couple nodded. "You can continue that for the first few months of your pregnancy," Christopher replied. "And then you can take a sabbatical. You don't have to be on maternity leave, so you don't have to miss much. And since you're a part-time student, you might not have to miss anything. And we'll reimburse you for missed work days," of course, Tara added. "In fact, all expenses will be on us. Doctor's exams, food, clothing, vitamins, trips to the hospital, and so on. But you'll also receive a substantial financial compensation." "You told me you wanted to buy a house near the city to live with your grandmother," Tara interjected. "If necessary, my husband and I can help you find the house of your dreams, with full renovations, furnishings, and furniture, and a convenient commute to the city for you and your grandmother." Lillian sighed. She'd been thinking about this for a long time. Her grandmother, though still vigorous, was not as strong and sturdy as she used to be. Lillian herself was not going to stay in the village, and it was unlikely that her veterinarian's salary would allow her to quickly save up for an apartment where she and her grandmother could live. "Please think about it," Tara took her hand gently. "You're our only hope. It won't be for long." "I don't know," Lillian sighed. "This is all very sudden." Tara nodded. Suddenly, tears welled up in her eyes, but she tried to hold them back. "Sorry, I'll step back," she said, and walked out of the dining room. Christopher stood up. "We don't want to pressure you," he said. "Just think it over at your leisure. In the meantime, my driver will take you back, and please don't tell anyone about our offer." "Of course," Lillian replied. She kept her word and did not tell about this conversation neither to Nicholas, with whom they had dinner after work, nor to her grandmother, to whom she went to celebrate New Year's holidays. "How are you here without me?" she asked Melissa. "I'm getting by," she said. "Of course it can be difficult, especially in winter. You know, without central heating, water supply, and a warm toilet, it's not very cozy here." Melissa noticed the upset look on her granddaughter's face and immediately corrected herself. "But that doesn't mean I'm complaining. I'm still able to take care of myself. Don't worry." "You never complain," Lillian sighed, noticing, as did her grandmother. After spending a few days with her grandmother, Lillian finally decided that she would accept the surrogacy offer. How much longer will Grandma be able to support herself? What if she falls while carrying water from the well, breaks a leg or catches a cold and gets sick? And in general, carrying heavy things at her age is not very healthy. "I agree," Lillian said as she called Tara. "Lillian, really?" "Yes. Oh, my girl. This is the best present my husband and I could have gotten. When can we see you?" The same taciturn driver took her to a familiar house. There, Lillian and the couple discussed the terms of the contract in detail. "Most importantly, you must keep it a secret," Christopher said seriously. "I absolutely insist that this condition be fulfilled, even if it concerns friends, lovers, and relatives." Lillian nodded. "Okay, I won't tell anyone. As we said, we'll cover all expenses," Christopher continued. "But you will be required to undergo certain tests, eat a healthy diet, get plenty of rest, and get at least 8 hours of sleep." "Like a vacation in a sanatorium?" Tara smiled. "Only we'll pay you for it." "Sounds great," Lillian smiled. "You'll also have a personal assistant," Christopher said. "His name is Henry," Christopher said. "He will drive you to the hospital, help you with shopping, and so on." "Is that necessary?" Lillian asked. "You can call on Henry as needed," said Tara. "You may not need it very often in the first few months. But believe me, it's going to get harder as you go along. And there's no reason to suffer when there's someone to help you." "Okay," Lillian replied. It took several months for a full examination, after which the doctors said that Lillian was perfectly healthy and could become a surrogate mother. They succeeded on their first try. "Oh, I'm so happy," Tara exclaimed, literally crying with joy. She hugged the girl and kissed her cheeks, flooding her with tears. Christopher, as always, was more reserved, but Lillian could see that he was happy too. "It was our destiny to meet you," Tara said with conviction. "It's scary to say this, but I consider it a sign of fate that my husband got sick and it brought us to your clinic." Ryan meowed loudly when he heard his name and jumped onto Lillian's lap. He had grown accustomed to her during his visits and now considered her a member of the family. "That's a sign," Tara nodded with conviction. Lillian was glad that everything had happened so quickly. The first few months of her pregnancy had been easy, and she had only occasionally used Henry's services. You get used to a good thing, she said as she got into his car after work. What's on the schedule for today? Ultrasound, eye doctor, dentist, and neurologist, he said as he turned the key in the ignition. Also, according to my calculations, you're running low on some vitamins, and we haven't been grocery shopping for a week. Lillian smiled. How do you remember all this? Henry shrugged. It's my job, Lillian. Especially compared to my other clients, you're using me 10% of the time. So your job is escorting surrogate mothers? Lillian wondered. Henry smiled for the first time in a while. My duties are a little broader than that. I just work as a personal assistant. It's interesting work, but most of the time I'm on my feet or in the car all day, Henry said. Do you have to drive around town a lot? Vanessa asked. He nodded. Tell me something interesting about your job, Vanessa asked. We still have a long drive ahead of us. Henry thought for a moment. I worked with a woman once. She made clothes to order, but not plain clothes, but themed ones, like Chinese princess dresses from the 15th century, or an elf archer costume, or something like that. How interesting, Vanessa exclaimed. Yes, and then we had to go to some woodworkers who made bows and arrows, then to a blacksmith, then to some handmade embroidery. Vanessa smiled. Well, I'm not so much fun to be with. You're nice and calm and very polite. I've worked with surrogate mothers a couple times, Henry said. Believe me, they made the most of that time. They'd call me at all hours of the day and night for anything. I'm so sorry for your loss, Lillian laughed. The examinations and tests showed that Lillian and the baby were doing well. The only thing that bothered her was the slowly but surely growing belly. She didn't know what she was going to say to Nicholas, because their communication already seemed to be going beyond the boundaries of boss-subordinate communication. Lillian actually liked Nicholas very much. At first, he tried not to show these feelings. After all, she was much younger than him. And besides, she is his subordinate. After all, who is she? Nicholas tried to convince himself. Just another young, stupid girl who was hired by an acquaintance. It only took him a couple of weeks, however, to be convinced otherwise. Lillian was good with animals, had excellent theoretical and practical training, always came to work on time, filled out paperwork accurately, and listened attentively to everything he said. She was cheerful, polite, and open. Nicholas realized that it had been a long time since he had met such a pleasant person. He decided that he would try to make friends with her. No one forbade him to do that. Nicholas also liked Melissa. It became clear how Lillian had such an upbringing and strong character. And then Lillian agreed to go out to dinner with him after work. And after that evening, Nicholas realized he was in love. He decided not to hurry. To confess his feelings, he did not want to frighten Lillian. Let everything go as it was going. He would be impeccably polite and professional with her at work. And when they had a chance to meet, he would begin to gradually, step by step, reduce the distance until Lillian is ready. And things seemed to be going well for him. Nicholas could see that she liked him too. Lillian laughed at his jokes. They'd hold hands when they went for walks. And then all of a sudden, things started to change. No, Lillian still looked at him with the same tenderness as before, didn't avoid him at work. She seemed to be just as open with him, except that Nicholas could see and feel that she was hiding something from him. Lillian had some business of her own that she didn't tell him anything about. A couple of times he noticed her being picked up from work by some young guy in the same car. Nicholas knew for a fact that Lillian had no brothers or friends here, so he was tormented with jealousy. I realized she doesn't owe me anything, he thought. I haven't even confessed my feelings to her, but I think it's clear enough. And if she has someone else, why won't she tell me? A couple of times he even tried to strike up a conversation with Lillian, asking if she had someone. Lillian only laughed. Not at all, Nicholas, she said. It was at work, so Lillian addressed her boss as you. I don't have time for this, she continued. Right now I'm all focused on work and school. Nicholas could hardly contain a sigh of relief. Besides, Lillian added suddenly, I don't want to meet anyone. I already have all the people in my life that I want to socialize with. She blushed. Nicholas suddenly felt his heart hammering hard. Did I understand you? He said, hiding a smile. He decided that it would only be a short time before he would ask her to go out with him. Then he suddenly noticed that Lillian was pregnant. Then how can you explain your pregnancy? I didn't want to believe it until the last minute. The whole clinic has been talking about it for 2 weeks. Lillian froze. She wanted to tell the truth. But she couldn't. She couldn't let down the couple who had entrusted her with their secret. I don't want to talk about it, she said in a trembling voice. That's it, said Nicholas. Good. It's clear to me. He left the office, slamming the door. Lillian cried. The next morning, Lillian went not to the office, but to her boss. There she wrote an application for maternity leave, and after that she went to the train station to buy a ticket for the bus to the village. She was lucky because there she met a fellow villager who was also going home. When Melissa saw her pregnant granddaughter, it was as if she wasn't even surprised. Lillian was afraid her grandmother would yell at her, bringing to mind her mother, who had gotten Lillian pregnant when she was also very young. But grandmother only asked one thing. Do you want to tell me what happened? Sorry, Grandma, Lillian sighed. I can't yet. Good, know that I'm always on your side. You can stay here as long as you want. Thank you, Grandma. I promise after this baby comes out, I'll be able to tell you everything. Okay, sweetheart, I hope you realize you're going to have a hard time in the village. They don't like us enough, and now you're the only one they're going to talk about. I'm prepared for that. Did you teach me to be strong? Grandma smiled. You've always been strong, my girl. Daughter, sweetheart, why did you scare us so much? Tara exclaimed the next time they were on the phone. What's wrong? Tara asked. I'm fine, Lillian replied. I just had to leave work earlier than I had planned. I'm going to live in the village with my grandmother until the birth. Don't worry, I feel fine. I'm taking my vitamins. If it's an emergency, they'll take me straight to the hospital. It's only an hour by car. Shouldn't you move into our house? Maybe? Tara asked. Lillian smiled. You said yourself that you have to keep everything secret, and it would be suspicious if an unknown pregnant girl lived with you for a few months and then disappeared, and you had a child. Tara sighed. Yes, you're right. Then we can get you whatever apartment you want in the city. No, Lillian said firmly. I'll stay in the village with my grandmother. I feel fine. It's only an hour's drive from the city. I'll get all the tests I need. But a week before the birth, Henry will come and take you to the clinic. I won't take no for an answer. Lillian smiled again. That's fine with me. And if you need anything, call him and me any time of the day or night. Okay, Tara replied. We'll be in touch anyway. I'll be waiting for your calls with the status report. That's a wonderful idea, sunshine. Despite the fact that Lillian was telling her grandmother as if she didn't care at all, the girl was having a hard time. Most of her fellow villagers were whispering behind her back. Quietly or loudly, they were discussing her. And besides them, there were those who almost openly threw it in Lillian's face. For example, her former classmate. What's up, Zivanareva? What's up, Zivanareva? Samantha said. I walked around the whole school with my head held high and pretended that we were all lowlifes, and you were blue bloods. Samantha had hated Lillian all 11 years, but she had only been afraid of the formidable Melissa and dared not bully her classmate. And now Samantha herself had already given birth to Aunt Carolyn's son, who had once been in love with Lillian by the alcoholic Ryan. Samantha thought she had a chance to get even with her rival. "I don't think so," Lillian said calmly. "You've been out on the town with no one to blame." "Who's the father?" continued her classmate. "You don't know." Lillian didn't answer. Of course she pretended it didn't hurt her. But in fact it was so painful to listen to all the dirty gossip and whispering. It's only a little longer, she told herself every day. She was also very upset that Nicholas had never called her. She berated herself so much for not talking to him. She should have broken the pact and told him everything or left before her belly became visible. And she should have confessed her feelings, told him she understood, that she'd noticed how much he liked her and that she liked him just as much. Except now it was too late. She'd betrayed his trust. Nicholas won't forgive that. "Okay," Lillian said to herself, "I have to think about Grandma, and also about school, and also about the promise I made to Tara and Christopher." The delivery date was getting closer. My stomach was getting heavier and lower, and my legs were already swelling badly. By the end of the day, my back was aching and I had to pee constantly. "Henry's coming to pick you up the day after tomorrow morning," Abigail said during another of her almost daily calls. "I'll remember," the girl replied. "I've already packed a bag." "Good for you. And let's dress warmly. The weather forecast promises a blizzard in the coming days." "Good, Tara. How are you feeling?" "I'm fine, by the way." Lillian lied. "I can't believe it's so soon. I feel lighter than I did in the middle of my pregnancy." "Let's hope it goes that way. It will be our best New Year's present ever." Lillian smiled. "Yes, if everything goes well, you will already be welcoming the new year with your daughter." She heard Tara sigh. "Oh, we're so excited, you can't imagine," Tara said. "We've already got everything ready in the nursery." "Yeah?" Lillian spent the next 40 minutes stroking her belly as she listened to Tara and Christopher talk excitedly about setting up the room for their future daughter. "Okay, honey, I'm rambling," suddenly exclaimed the woman. "You should get some rest." "Have a good day and you have a good day," Lillian replied and passed out. She came out of her room and saw Melissa dressing as if she was going out. Lillian shivered at the icy draft and looked out the window. There she could already see the wind beginning to ruffle the branches of the trees. "Grandmother, where are you going?" Lillian asked. Melissa nodded and began to tighten her coat. "Yes, a neighboring farm has asked to see a breeding stallion." "And you're going out in this weather?" Grandma waved her hand away. "They'll take me there by car. Besides, they're supposed to have some fancy doctor from the city." "That's great. In that case, why do you have to go? Or are you having a consilium?" "They can't reach him. They can't get him on the phone. Maybe he can't even make it because of the snowstorm. Then it will be necessary to at least examine the animal and give him a couple of supportive treatments so that the stallion will last until the morning," Grandmother said firmly. "Lillian, you're not going anywhere in this weather." "I am," Melissa snorted. "Yeah, you're about to give birth." Lillian resolutely started to get dressed. "It won't be soon. I feel fine." "Lillian, Grandma. Who said it was quick and easy? You're such a stubborn girl, just like you." Melissa laughed. "Okay, but be careful." "Don't worry, Grandma." The blizzard was getting worse. "Are we going to be okay?" Lillian asked the son of the owner of the company who was driving her. Yes, we still have about 20 minutes to go, he replied. You'll forgive us for disturbing you in this weather, but the stallion is our everything. My father invested so much money in him, we had to take out a loan. If he dies, we'll go bankrupt. And our company employs so many people in the surrounding villages. Grandma Melissa told me. Since you built the farm, many of my neighbors have jobs. It was always my father's dream, he said simply. He put everything he had into this farm. Lillian nodded. I promise I'll do everything I can for your stallion. After the examination, it was clear that the stallion would live. Lillian told the owners, who breathed a sigh of relief. I know you have a city specialist, an experienced veterinarian, coming to see you, she said. We don't know yet, sighed the farm owner. We can't reach him because of the snowstorm. Okay, Lillian said. I'm going to give him a couple of shots and record the treatment. If your doctor doesn't come, follow it. When she had finished with the stallion and was about to ask for a ride home, the farm owner said, Oh, just arrived. The doctor can have a word. I don't remember what you said or what shots you gave. No problem, Lillian said. She waited for the town doctor to get out of the car and come to the stables. Where's our breeding patient? She heard a familiar voice. Lillian's heart raced. What was this stupid game of fate? Lillian. Nicholas seemed as surprised as she was. What are you doing here? He asked coldly. I was examining the stallion, Lillian replied. I forgot you lived nearby, Nicholas sighed. Is that the local doctor they told me about? All right, you'll tell me all about him, he said. It will be quicker that way. I don't want to be outside too long, it's already blizzarding. Nicholas hated to admit it to himself, but he was glad to see Lillian suddenly. How he'd missed her. Yes, he was angry that she hadn't told him about her relationship and pregnancy, but how much he missed her. And now he looked at her so familiar face, eyes, lips, and couldn't tear himself away. He wanted to spend just a few minutes with her, to hear her voice, to look into her big blue eyes. What he asked, because he'd been thinking and hadn't heard what Lillian had said. I said, Did you examine the stallion too? Lillian repeated to her husband. Nicholas blinked confusedly. Of course. I trust you completely, though he added, when it comes to work, of course. Lillian flared up but didn't answer. After examining and telling Lillian, Nicholas said, I absolutely agree with your diagnosis and the treatment prescribed. You will make a fine veterinarian. Lillian lowered her eyes. Thank you. Nicholas suddenly thought how much he didn't feel like going home right now. How's the baby? He asked, nodding at Lillian's belly. It's fine, Lillian replied. The tentative delivery date is a little over a week away. Already. Yeah, you live here with your grandmother, Nicholas finished quickly for her. We live with her, Lillian nodded. Nicholas nodded. Would you like a ride home? He asked. I don't want Brandon to have to drive back in this weather. I'm on my way anyway. You'll have to make a detour, Lillian said. It's no problem for me. If Melissa doesn't mind, I'll have a cup of tea at your place. Lillian smiled. Thank you, Nicholas. That's a good idea. As they drove, Nicholas was filled with questions. Why had she come to the village? Where was the child's father? Who was he? He was so thoughtful that he didn't even immediately notice the change in Lillian's expression. What happened? He asked. My stomach hurts, she said. It's very tight. Well said, Nicholas. How long has it been? It started when I was examining Charlotte. I didn't notice it at first. It's been happening a lot lately, but it usually goes away in a few minutes. Now it's just getting worse. Nicholas gripped the steering wheel with his fingers. We have to go to the hospital, he said firmly. How far to the nearest one? About an hour, Lillian said. But you don't have to do that. He waved her off. Come on. It's a blizzard. There's no telling how long the ambulance will take to get to your village. I'll drive you myself. Thank you, Nicholas, Lillian said. He shrugged. It's not hard for me to do that for you. Of course, he had to pretend that everything was under control, that he wasn't afraid. But in truth, Nicholas had never been so afraid. The wind was picking up, visibility was only a few meters. He wanted to go faster, but he was afraid. How do you feel? He asked cheerfully. Normal, Lillian replied weakly. But with his side vision, he could see drops of sweat on her temples. He could hear her breathing hard, feel her teeth clenching in pain. We'll be there soon, Nicholas said cheerfully, gripping the steering wheel harder. Suddenly the car hummed strangely, and then there was a sound like a gunshot. The car jumped and began to slow down. Nicholas barely had time to turn the steering wheel before they were swept off the road. Damn it, he shouted. What happened? Lillian asked weakly. Don't worry, I'll find out, Nicholas said cheerfully. In fact, he was lying. Nicholas didn't know anything about cars. He went out rather to cool down, to breathe fresh frosty air and to understand what could be done. Opened the hood. If there was something wrong, Nicholas didn't realize it. Shit, he swore again as he closed the hood. The cable. It's cold. Gotta get back in the car. Gotta calm Lillian down. Gotta figure out what to do about this situation. Well, how's it going without me? He asked cheerfully as he came back in and closed the door tightly. Normal, Lillian replied. What's wrong with the car? I don't know, honestly said Nicholas. But that's okay. I'll take care of it. He saw the look in her eyes, so helpless, so frightened and hopeful. I'll figure it out, Nicholas said firmly. Don't worry. He unfolded the back seat and helped Lillian into it. Get comfortable, he said. Are you going to deliver the baby in the car? She asked fearfully. I hope I don't have to, Nicholas said honestly. But if anything, I can do it. I'm a doctor. Lillian smiled weakly. Veterinarian doctor, she corrected. People are animals too, Nicholas parried. Lillian laughed, but immediately cried out in pain. I'll try to call, Nicholas said. There was no connection in the car. He jumped outside, where the wind was literally knocking him off his feet. 10 minutes later, when his fingers were freezing, he finally got a connection. The ambulance promised to come as fast as it could, weather permitting. Nothing. We'll hold out. You just get us out of here, Nicholas said. He was told that everything possible would be done. How's that? He asked Lillian when he got back. It was getting noticeably cooler in the car. Nicholas took off his jacket and threw it over Lillian. I'm hanging in there, the girl replied. Except that the pains have become more intense. I think it's real. And what? They're on their way to pick us up, Nicholas replied. Lillian nodded, then pressed her white lips together and suddenly asked, Don't leave me, please. I'm so scared. I won't, I promise. The minutes, or maybe hours, of the ambulance ride seemed like an eternity to Nicholas. When he could see the flashing lights through the blizzard, he felt a great sense of relief. All the way to the hospital, Lillian didn't let go of his hand. It's going to be all right. He repeated and put a smile on his face. "You're a good girl. We got through it all." He was even allowed to be present during the birth. Of course, the doctors thought he was the father. He didn't explain anything, he didn't have time for that. After everything was over, Nicholas went out into the hallway. He was shaking with fatigue. Lillian had just fallen asleep. Her daughter was being carried in for a checkup. Melissa was already standing in the hallway. "How's my granddaughter?" she asked. Nicholas nodded. "She's fine. So is your great-granddaughter." Melissa raised her eyebrows. "Great-granddaughter? She didn't tell you anything?" Just 2 days before, Lillian had broken the terms of her contract and told her grandmother everything. She decided it would be too cruel if she went to the maternity ward and came back without the baby. Melissa took the news, like everyone else, calmly. "You're doing a good thing for good people," she replied. "Of course, I would have taken your baby and raised it the way I raised you," Melissa said. "But it's a good thing you didn't. You're very young. You have to study and work." The grandmother was sure that her granddaughter had told the young doctor everything. She realized that Nicholas was not just a boss and mentor for Lillian. But if her granddaughter decided not to tell him about her secret, who was she to interfere? Lillian will tell her when she's ready. "Thank you for doing all this for her," Melissa said. "I was just in the right place at the right time." "Anyone would have done that," Nicholas replied. "But you were the one who was there for her. I'm going downstairs for coffee." When Nicholas came down the stairs, he saw a familiar man in the hall. He was asking the receptionist about something. It took the doctor a few minutes to remember where he'd seen him. Sure enough, this was the guy who had picked Lillian up from the clinic that evening. She was still leaving with him. "Well, now that the kid's father is here, I'm definitely not needed anymore," Nicholas thought grimly. "I don't know what she had with him, but it's certainly none of my business anymore." He walked out of the hospital. When Lillian came to, the first person she saw was her grandmother. She was sitting beside her bed, holding her granddaughter's hand. Then Lillian saw Henry, Christopher, and Thera. The last one was holding a small package. "How are you feeling?" Melissa asked softly. "Normal," Lillian replied. "How's the baby? Is she okay?" Tara looked up at her, her eyes full of gratitude and tears. "We've decided to name her Hillary," Christopher said. Lillian smiled. "It's a very pretty name." "Thank you," Tara said. Lillian suddenly realized that she couldn't see Nicholas. "If it weren't for Nicholas, Hillary and I wouldn't be here," she said. "Where is he, by the way?" Melissa sighed. "I saw him. I think Nicholas left." Grandma sighed. "As always, you can't be argued with." Melissa herself, in addition to her personal belongings, took some of the dishes and framed photographs that had hung on the walls for years. "If you say you have everything you need to live," she said, referring to the old beds, armchairs, table, and chairs, "I'll leave this junk here. If you want Christopher put in, we can find movers, rent a car, and they can move every last nail." Melissa waved her hand. "Don't give me that. She's sick of it. I haven't lived here as much as I've been hiding from myself for 20 years. Christopher nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. And it's good that you decided to get out. I know how to see strong people. Both you and your granddaughter are strong. That's why you shouldn't sit here alone. And Lillian has no business being here. That's for sure. She's going to make a great doctor." The new house in Miami was even nicer than Lillian had imagined. It was in a new part of town. It was about 20 minutes from the center of the city. It was just as new and beautiful. How much is it worth? Lillian thought with quiet horror. But she didn't share her thoughts with her grandmother. The house had 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, a bath, a toilet, and 2 offices. "We thought you both liked to work," Tara said. "And you need your own space." "Yeah, I'm a hard worker," Melissa smiled. "You're going to write your memoirs," her granddaughter said. "It's about time." Henry had done his best. Even the yard was festooned with garlands, colored lights winking and hanging in long, thin ribbons along the terrace. "How much did all this cost?" Lillian gasped. "You haven't seen the inside yet," Henry smiled slyly. As soon as Lillian and Melissa stepped through the door, they both felt as if they had returned to their real home after a long absence. "Everything is just as it should be," Lillian said. A blazing fireplace, soft armchairs, the lights dimmed a little. There was a tall Christmas tree in the living room, which made Lillian feel childishly excited. "It's so nice," she said. "It's wonderful here," Melissa said. "I'm glad you like it," Henry said simply. Tara came over. She was trying to keep her voice down because little Hillary had just fallen asleep in her arms. "The men will bring your things in, and we'll leave you to it," she said. "Come and rest." "Thank you, Tara, and thank you, Christopher," Lillian said warmly. "Thank you, daughter," Christopher said. "And we invite you to celebrate the new year with us," Tara said. Lillian and her grandmother looked at each other. "We accept the invitation," Melissa replied. The New Year's Eve celebration left Lillian with ambivalent feelings. She stood at the window, watching the fireworks, and couldn't believe that her life had changed so drastically in just 1 year. Of course, she didn't regret her decision. There was nothing more beautiful than watching a happy Tara and Christopher standing over the crib with little Hillary. And Lillian was even somewhat proud that she was the one who could give them that happiness. And she and her grandmother now live in a beautifully landscaped house. And Lillian knows that Melissa will no longer have to live alone, carrying firewood, fetching water from the well, heating the stove. Now Lillian can be near her beloved grandmother every day. They are together again. They are again a support for each other. Only she'll never see Nicholas again. Of course, the New Year's holidays will pass, and she can return to her studies. But it's unlikely she'll dare to go back to her old job, which means she won't see him again. She wouldn't hear him laughing when Lillian told her about an incident from her village practice, and she wouldn't see Nicholas carefully and professionally examining another cat or dog. She suddenly remembers how he drove her to the hospital through a snowstorm, how he calmed her down and tried to joke when the car broke down, how he held her hand in the ambulance, and then during labor. If she had only known then, as she fell asleep, that she was seeing him for the last time, she would never have fallen asleep. "What are you crying about, sweetheart?" Lillian did not even notice how Tara silently approached her. The woman hugged her affectionately with her small white hand. "It's all right," Lillian said. "Just remembering a good man I'll never see again." She wiped her tears with the sleeve of her dress. Tara frowned. "He's alive, isn't he? So you can still see him?" Lillian shook her head. "I'm very guilty before him, and I know he'll never forgive me or want to see me." Tara put her arms around the girl and pulled her close to her. Her pensive gaze was fixed somewhere in the distance, but she asked Lillian nothing more. "3," Melissa asked confidently. She looked at her granddaughter sternly. Lillian sighed. "Yes, Grandma, I won't be able to work there. I'll pick up my paperwork today. I know the clinic your student runs is the best in the city, but there are a lot of other good ones. I'm sure they'll take me somewhere else." "Of course," Melissa replied. "But you know that's not what I mean. You need to talk to your Nicholas." Lillian blushed. "He's not mine." She cut her off and ran to her grandmother's house. She kissed Melissa and ran out the door. Stubborn Grandma sighed but smiled. Lillian really didn't want to go into the office where she had worked under Nicholas for so many months, but there were some of her personal belongings left there that needed to be picked up. She arrived early before the workday started, hoping to get everything in before the doctor and his new assistant came in to start the appointment. The plan had almost succeeded. Lillian had already put away everything she wanted when the door opened and a familiar male voice sounded. Lillian. She turned around, blushing. Hello. Sorry, I wanted to get some of my stuff. I didn't realize you'd be here so early. Nicholas frowned. Where are you going? Where are you going? Lillian took a deep breath. I'm quitting. Why? She averted her eyes, unable to bear the direct, piercing stare of his brown eyes. I don't think we should work together, Lillian said. Nicholas raised an eyebrow mockingly. Why have I offended you in any way? I remember the last time we met, you didn't want to let go of my hand and asked me not to leave. What's changed? Lillian got angry. You know very well what has changed, and you've made it very clear to me. Besides, if it weren't for the circumstances, it's unlikely you'd be willingly holding my hand. She shook the bag of belongings decisively and took a few steps towards the exit. It's been a pleasure working with you, Lillian said quickly and abruptly, as if afraid to change her mind. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go. Nicholas smiled. He stood up, blocking the way. Then suddenly he took her hand gently, looked into her eyes and said, I know everything. Lillian thought she had misheard. Know what? All about surrogacy? But how? He smiled. I got a call from an old client yesterday. I thought something had happened to her cat again. But the cat's fine. Lillian gasped. So Tara told you everything herself? Nicholas nodded. She said she saw you crying on New Year's Eve and began to guess something. And then, with your grandmother's help, she confirmed her guesses. I hope they're both right. And the reason you're crying is really because of me. Lillian laughed. Whatever the situation, Nicholas always knew how to make her laugh. Are they wrong? He asked worriedly. What about the mystery? Lillian asked, ignoring his question. They didn't want anyone to know about it, did they? Tara said that she and her husband were so happy that they didn't care now, even if the whole world finds out that it was you who carried their child. Lillian smiled. You didn't answer the question, Nicholas added. Surely you can guess that I like you? Lillian replied. And after you didn't run away from my labor and fainted, I decided to run away right after it. Lillian laughed. So now it's okay for me not to quit? She asked. Nicholas nodded. What's more, I hope that you will work with me in this clinic for many more years, first as an assistant and then as a colleague. I hope so too, Lillian said. But haven't you found a new assistant? The doctor shook his head negatively. I was waiting for you to come back. That was stupid, Lillian sighed. And it would have been nice, Nicholas continued, ignoring her remark, if you'd started seeing me. Unless, of course, you're really in love with that guy who picked you up after work. Lillian laughed. Now I see what upset you back then. No, I'm not in love with Henry. She rose on tiptoe and kissed Nicholas on the lips. He gently wrapped his arms around her, pulled her close, and kissed her back.